Hey hey. Welcome back to Arcane Paradox. We've got something fire today. What if Fleur's Veela aura broke through 15 Dumbledore's blocks on Harry during champion selection ceremony? Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1, Cracks in the Glass. The Great Hall had never felt smaller. That was the thing about magic, Harry thought. It had a way of making enormous spaces feel intimate when it wanted to, like the castle itself was leaning in. For long tables packed with students, candles floating in their hundreds overhead, the enchanted ceiling dark and rolling with October clouds. It should have felt vast. Instead, it felt like a held breath. The delegations had arrived 2 days ago, and Hogwarts still hadn't quite recovered from the novelty of it. The Beauxbatons students moved through the corridors in pale blue robes like they owned the place, which apparently worked on most people, and the Durmstrang boys stamped around in their furs like they were daring the Scottish weather to argue with them. Harry had watched it all with the vague, pleasant detachment that had characterized most of his life at Hogwarts. Things happened around him, and he noted them, and moved on. He was sitting between Ron and Hermione now, the Halloween feast spread across the table in its usual ridiculous abundance, and he was eating a chicken leg and not thinking very hard about anything in particular. Ron was speculating loudly about the Triwizard Tournament. Hermione was pretending not to be interested while clearly being very interested. It was a normal evening. Then the Beauxbatons students rose from their table. Harry noticed them the way he noticed most things, peripherally, without urgency. A group of girls, maybe a dozen, moving toward the front of the hall in a formation that was either choreographed or the result of being extraordinarily comfortable in your own skin. He assumed it was a performance of some kind, an introduction from their school. Probably Dumbledore had arranged it. Probably it would be fine. He bit into his chicken leg. Then the girl in front began to walk. She was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that people politely called statuesque to avoid saying something rude, but the kind of tall that just was, like height was simply her natural state of existence. Her hair was the color of very old silver, pale and luminous under the candlelight, and it moved when she walked in a way that hair didn't technically have to move. She had her chin up. Not arrogantly, Harry thought distantly, more like she had simply never learned to hold it any other way. He wasn't staring. He was just looking. There was a difference. The girl, the young woman, passed the Gryffindor table, and Harry felt something shift. It started small. A warmth behind his sternum, like swallowing something hot. Not unpleasant. He assumed it was the fire whiskey flavoring someone had added to the pumpkin juice again and made a mental note to check his cup. But the warmth didn't fade the way a drink would. It spread, moving outward from his chest like rings on water, and where it went, something was changing. The first thing he noticed was the light. The candles above the Gryffindor table suddenly looked different, not brighter, exactly, but more present, as though he'd been viewing them through fogged glass his entire life and the glass had just been wiped clean. He could see the individual flames, the way they bent when students moved below them, the colors within the fire that he'd never registered before, blue at the base, orange at the crown, a white-hot core that had always been there and which he had simply never seen. Harry blinked. The warmth moved again, pushing upward now, climbing through his chest and into his throat, his jaw, the back of his skull. It didn't hurt. That was the strangest part. It felt like the opposite of hurt, like some persistent ache he'd been carrying so long he'd mistaken it for his own body was finally, gently, being removed. He heard something. Not a sound from the hall was noisy, it was always noisy, 100 conversations and the clatter of silverware and Peeves cackling distantly from somewhere up near the ceiling. This was different. This was more like a click, quiet and precise, like the mechanism of a very fine lock turning over somewhere inside his head. Something eased. He didn't know what to call it, the thing that eased. It was like a door opening in a dark corridor, and behind the door was not darkness but more light, and in the light were things he should have always been able to see. He could feel magic in the room, feel it the way you might feel warmth radiating off stone that had sat in sunlight all day, Hermione to his left, always precise and humming with controlled energy, Ron to his right, bright and unsteady and genuinely powerful under all that fumbling. The teachers at the head table. The wards in the walls. And Dumbledore. Harry's eyes moved to the headmaster almost involuntarily, and that was when the second click came. It was louder than the first. Where before he'd felt a vague, lifelong reverence for Albus Dumbledore, the kind of unexamined respect that accumulates in a child who is told from the beginning that this man is the greatest wizard alive and that he is on your side, now he felt something more complex threading through the reverence like wire through wool. He could see Dumbledore's magic. Not visually, not with his eyes, but in the way you might sense the framework of a building by touching its walls, the structure beneath, the load-bearing points. And Dumbledore's magic was everywhere. It was in the room. It was in the wards. It was in the enchantments on the ceiling and the charms on the house tables and the ancient workings woven into Hogwarts stone over centuries. And it was in Harry's head. The third click was not quiet at all. Harry's hand went to his temple without him deciding to move it. Not because it hurt, it still didn't hurt, but because the sensation was so abrupt and so enormous that he needed to orient himself, needed to check that the physical world was still where he'd left it. The Great Hall was still there. The chicken leg was still in his other hand. Ron was still talking. But something had just snapped loose inside his skull like a door blown off its hinges by a strong wind, and the room behind that door was vast and full of things that were his and that he had never been allowed to access. The fourth click came before he'd finished processing the third. He understood, dimly, that something was wrong. Or that something had been wrong, for a very long time, and was now in the process of becoming right. Both were true simultaneously and he couldn't hold them both steady. He put down the chicken leg. "You all right?" Ron asked, without really looking at him. His eyes were glazed in the direction of the Beauxbatons girls. "Yeah," Harry said. His own voice sounded strange to him, clearer, more present, like it was coming from closer than usual. "Fine." The fifth click. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Behind his eyelids, something that had been compressed for years, not memories, not knowledge, something more fundamental, something more like capacity, was quietly, steadily unfolding. Like a fist opening. Like wings deciding to extend after a long time folded. He thought, "I've been smaller than I'm supposed to be." He thought, "Someone made me this way." He thought, "Dumbledore." The sixth click. His eyes opened. Across the hall, the tall silver-haired girl from Beauxbatons had reached the front, and she was, he understood now, because the understanding was part of what was coming back to him, she was half Veela, and the aura she projected was not a trick or a performance but something old and genuine and wild. It was the aura that had started this. It had hit him like a key in a lock he didn't know he had. He was not in love with her. He was not enchanted by her. That, too, he could now feel with clarity, the Veela effect touching the edges of him and finding nothing to grip, because whatever part of a person the Veela charm worked on, Harry's was currently occupied with something far more immediate. He watched her dance, because she was dancing now, the Beauxbatons students performing some formal introduction that involved graceful, unhurried movement, and he thought she was exceptional in the way that anyone who is completely at ease in their own body is exceptional. But mostly he was watching the magic around her. The Veela aura was a living thing, warm and golden at its edges, ancient in its construction, wild in its intent. It wasn't dark magic. It was barely even controlled magic. It was something closer to weather. The seventh click. Something specific came loose, something that had been sitting on his emotional register like a stone on a pressure valve. He felt it lift and recognized immediately what had been underneath it, a completely legitimate, long overdue anger. Not the hot, reactive anger that had always burned through him when Malfoy said something or Snape sneered, that anger had always been available, small and sharp and ultimately harmless. This was different. This was the anger of someone who had been systematically diminished and had not been given the tools to recognize it. He breathed. In. Out. He filed the anger somewhere accessible but not dominant. He could be angry later. Right now he had things to think about. 8th. His awareness of the room sharpened so dramatically that it almost felt physical. He could hear conversations 3 tables away with sudden clarity, not because his hearing had changed, but because whatever had been muffling his ability to focus had lifted and he was now operating at something closer to his actual capacity. He heard Karkaroff muttering to one of his students. He heard Professor McGonagall telling Flitwick something about the judging criteria. He heard, most distantly and most importantly, a brief exchange in French between 2 of the Beauxbatons students, the tall silver-haired girl and a shorter dark-haired one beside her, in which the shorter girl said, "Something happened with the English boy," and the tall one, still dancing, still moving with that unhurried grace, turned her head fractionally in the direction of the Gryffindor table. She caught Harry's eye. He didn't look away. He hadn't used to be able to hold eye contact with people who looked like her, with people who looked like they fully expected the world to rearrange itself for their convenience, because that kind of certainty had always made him feel like he was trespassing. Now he held her gaze and simply looked back, and her expression shifted in a way that was very small and very interesting. The corners of her eyes tightened slightly, like someone recalibrating. She looked away first. The 9th click. This one came with a flood of something warm and dense that Harry initially mistook for emotion and then recognized as memory, not new memories. Nothing had been taken from him that way, but existing memories recontextualized, seen now from the higher ground of an unblocked mind. He remembered Dumbledore's hand on his shoulder the summer after first year, and he remembered now what he hadn't been able to register then, the slight push, gentle as a suggestion, that had accompanied the touch. He remembered the lemon drops that Dumbledore always offered, and thought, those were never just sweets, were they? He remembered dozens of conversations, the cave, the end of 2nd year, the end of 3rd, in all of which Dumbledore had known more than he shared and steered more than he led. He thought, he loves me. He thought that right alongside the anger, and held both. He thought, love and control are not the same thing. 10th. His magic, which had always been like a river in a narrow gorge, powerful but channeled, forced into particular shapes by its own constriction, suddenly had more room. He felt it expand and felt his jaw tighten in response, because the expansion was enormous and it kept going, pushing into areas of his magical core that had apparently never been used, and the sensation was extraordinary and slightly overwhelming and also, underneath everything, absolutely right in a way that nothing about his magical education had ever felt right before. He thought, this is what I'm supposed to feel like. This is what I actually am. He noticed his wand was warm through the fabric of his robes. 11th. 12th. 2 in quick succession, both of them related to something Harry could only describe as strategic thinking, as though the blocks on his processing had been reinforcing each other and these 2 fell together. He saw the great hall, the tournament, the goblet burning at the front of the room, and he understood, without needing to think it through carefully, the shape of what was happening. He understood the political geometry of the Triwizard Tournament. He understood why Dumbledore had arranged for Hogwarts to host it this year, of all years. He understood why the age line had been drawn, and who it was meant to keep out, and who, despite that, was expected to get in. He thought, I was always meant to enter this tournament. He thought, not by Dumbledore. By whoever put my name in that goblet. He thought, those are 2 different plans, and they might not be the same person. 13th. Something deeply personal, this one, a block on self-worth so fundamental and so old that its removal felt like the ground shifting. Harry sat very still and let the feeling settle. He was not arrogant by nature, and the block's absence didn't make him arrogant now. What it did was remove the reflexive, instinctive self-minimizing that had governed every interaction of his Hogwarts career, the "oh, it's probably just luck and I'm sure someone else could do this better and I shouldn't make a fuss." That voice went quiet. Not silenced, it was still there, quieter and more distant, the genuine humility that was his own and which had nothing to do with Dursley conditioning or Dumbledore's architectural caution. He could simply say, I'm good at this. I'm actually quite good at this. He had never been able to say that without immediately finding a reason to take it back. 14th. This one took longer, and Harry braced without consciously deciding to brace. This was something larger. He could feel the size of it by the way the block had been constructed, with more care and deliberateness than the others, as though whoever had built it had known this particular suppression mattered most. It was on his connection to magic itself, not just his power but his relationship with it, his ability to work with magic intuitively, to feel its currents and respond naturally rather than just pointing and incanting and hoping the formula was right. When it broke, he heard music. Not literally. But there was a quality to what he felt that he had no other word for. The magic in the room had always been there but now it was speaking, and he could understand it the way you understand a language you grew up surrounded by but were prevented from learning. Some part of him had always known the grammar of it, and now the barrier was gone. He understood, sitting at the Gryffindor table on a Halloween night, why the founders had built Hogwarts here and not somewhere else. He understood why the staircases moved. He understood why the room of requirement worked the way it did. Not because he'd been told, because he could feel it, the way you might feel the intention of an architect by standing in a room they designed. He understood, suddenly and with complete certainty, why Hermione always said that magical theory and magical practice were different disciplines. He had always thought she meant it academically. He understood now that she was describing a real and fundamental divide, and that he had just stepped, for the first time in his life, into the world where they were not separate at all but the same thing seen from different angles. He let out a breath that he felt had been held for 4 years. 15th. It was almost gentle, the 15th, after the enormity of the 14th. A small block, near the surface, doing one specific job. Harry identified its function immediately when it broke. It had been suppressing his ability to recognize when he was being managed. Not deceived exactly, not preventing him from detecting outright lies, but preventing him from feeling the texture of a conversation that was being guided by someone else's agenda. A very precise, very subtle thing. Devastating in its implications. He thought about every conversation he'd ever had with Dumbledore. He thought about every time he'd left the headmaster's office feeling reassured and purposeful and appropriately resigned to whatever difficult thing was expected of him. He thought, every single one of those conversations went exactly the way Dumbledore needed it to go. He sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then he folded it up and put it somewhere accessible and moved on, because the Beauxbatons performance was ending and Dumbledore was rising at the head table and the ancient goblet of fire was sitting at the front of the hall, and Harry had approximately 4 minutes before the evening became something he needed to actively navigate rather than simply survive. The Beauxbatons students were returning to their table. The silver-haired girl passed the Gryffindor table again, moving in the opposite direction, and as she did, Harry turned his head and watched her openly. She had a particular quality that he could see clearly now, a wariness beneath the composure, the slightly elevated alertness of someone who is always waiting to be treated as less than they are. She was watching for it even now, the dismissal or the leering or the clumsy attempt at conversation that would reduce her to her appearance. She had, Harry thought, been waiting for that reaction from every room she'd ever walked into. He said nothing. He simply looked at her with the same directness she'd used on him 10 minutes ago, and she caught it again, and this time the recalibration in her eyes was more pronounced. Her chin tilted slightly. Not away, just adjusting for something she hadn't expected. Then Dumbledore was speaking about the tournament, and Harry turned to face the front of the hall, and he made himself very still and very attentive. He listened differently now. He heard not just what Dumbledore said but what the words were doing, how each sentence was constructed to create a particular feeling in the room, how the warmth and gravity of the headmaster's voice built an atmosphere of significance, of occasion, of trust. It was masterful. Harry could appreciate it as craft while also seeing it clearly for what it was. Dumbledore was, among everything else, the most accomplished person in any room he entered at shaping how that room felt. The man wasn't wrong to use that skill. But Harry could see the use now, which he'd never fully been able to do before. The champions from previous years were announced, the names from history, the tradition of it, Dumbledore calibrating the room's reverence beautifully. Then the goblet of fire was described, and its purpose, and the age line, and the dangers of the tournament, and the eternal glory, and the prize money that made even the older students lean forward slightly. Ron was vibrating with excitement. "Reckon I've got a chance." "With a confundus charm on the goblet, it won't work," Harry said. Ron looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because whatever Dumbledore built into that age line isn't a simple detection charm. It's keyed to magical maturity, not chronological age. You'd need to alter your actual magical signature, not just fool a censor." Harry paused, hearing himself say it, feeling the ease of it, the way the analysis had simply arrived, fully formed, without effort. He'd never talked like that before. "It's not worth the risk." Hermione was staring at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, in the tone that meant, "several things, actually, and I'm cataloging them." He turned back to the front of the hall. The goblet was burning, and students were lining up, and Dumbledore was watching the room with that particular expression Harry had always interpreted as benevolent satisfaction and now read as something more layered: satisfaction, yes, but also calculation. The headmaster's eyes swept the hall, student by student, and Harry watched the sweep, and he saw Dumbledore's gaze pass over the goblet, and over Karkaroff, and over the Beauxbatons table, and finally reach the Gryffindor table and settle, briefly, on Harry. Something moved in those blue eyes. Not alarm, Dumbledore was far too controlled for alarm. But something shifted, a very small recalibration, and Harry met the gaze with a calmness that he had never managed before in Dumbledore's presence and held it for a 3 count before looking away to reach for his pumpkin juice. Behind him, he heard Dumbledore exhale, barely audible, barely there, and yet. And yet. The feast wound down. Students filed out. In the morning they would queue up to submit their names, and by Halloween night the goblet would have made its selections. Hogwarts was louder than usual as the tables emptied, everyone speculating, the older students mostly confident, the younger ones envious. Harry walked back to Gryffindor Tower between Ron and Hermione and said very little, which was normal enough that neither of them questioned it, though Hermione kept glancing at him with that cataloging expression. He lay in his bed that night and stared at the canopy and took stock. 15 blocks. He ran through them methodically, the way he might check his Quidditch equipment before a match, not panicking, just assessing. Magical awareness. Emotional depth. Strategic processing. Self-worth. Connection to magic itself. Ability to detect manipulation. The others were variations on these, reinforcing structures, load-bearing elements in an architecture that had been designed to produce a very specific kind of person, reactive, loyal, not quite reaching his potential, perpetually a step behind the people who were supposed to be guiding him. Was Dumbledore evil? Harry thought about this in the quiet dark of the dormitory, listening to Neville breathe in the next bed and Dean mutter something in his sleep. He rolled the question over and looked at it from the angles his returned intelligence could now manage. No. He didn't think so. What he thought was more uncomfortable and more true than simple villainy. He thought Dumbledore loved him, and believed entirely in the importance of what he was doing, and had decided, with the absolute certainty of someone who has been the most powerful mind in the room for decades, that his own judgment about what Harry needed to be was more reliable than Harry's right to become it. He thought Dumbledore had looked at an 11-year-old boy who'd survived Voldemort once by love and accident, and decided that the instrument that would be needed to survive him again should be carefully managed. Kept to purpose. Kept in place. He thought Dumbledore was very wise and very wrong and probably, somewhere, knew it. He thought, I'm not going to pretend the blocks weren't there. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know. He thought, I'm also not going to charge into his office and accuse him of anything, because that's exactly the kind of reactive, unstrategic behavior someone expects from a person they've spent 4 years underestimating. He smiled at the ceiling of the dormitory. He thought, I'm going to be excellent in this tournament. I'm going to be outstanding in it. He thought, and I'm going to be interested in that silver-haired girl, because whatever she did to those blocks, whether she intended to or not, I owe her something for it. He fell asleep faster than he'd expected to, and his sleep was deep and clear and free of dreams. In the morning, the queue to the goblet was already long before breakfast had finished. Harry watched it from the Gryffindor table and didn't join it, eating his toast with the same unhurried pace as always, watching the older Gryffindors in their self-imposed ceremonial gravity as they submitted their names. Fred and George had spent the previous night attempting some kind of aging potion. Harry could see from across the hall that it hadn't worked, because both of them now had long grey beards and Fred appeared to be arguing with his own ears. "Brilliant," Ron said, delighted. "Predictable," Harry said. Hermione gave him the look again. He ignored it pleasantly. He waited until the queue had thinned to a handful of seventh years, then stood and walked across the hall to the goblet. Not because he'd decided to enter, he hadn't, but because he wanted to look at it up close, with his new senses, and understand what it was actually doing. Up close, the goblet was extraordinary. He could feel the magic in it like heat radiates from a fire, ancient, enormous, impersonal. It didn't care about him. It didn't care about anyone. It was a mechanism, a very sophisticated and very powerful one, and its function was selection, and its criteria were not exactly what Dumbledore had described. Or, they were what Dumbledore had described, but also more. The goblet was looking for champions. What it meant by champion was its own definition, built into its construction centuries ago, and Harry stood in front of it and felt that definition humming in the air around the blue-white flame. It meant, the most powerful magical individual available who is also capable of surviving the tasks that will be set. It meant, threat potential, strategic intelligence, core power, resilience. It meant, not age, not necessarily experience, not reputation. It meant, Harry realized, that if someone put his name in this cup, it would probably choose him. Because those were criteria he met. However carefully he'd been managed, the raw material had always been there. He stared at the flame. "You're not going to put your name in," said a voice. He turned. Fleur Delacour was standing 2 feet away, watching him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, evaluating, curious, and carrying the very faint residual wariness that he'd noticed last night. Up close, the Veela quality to her was less overwhelming and more interesting, a warmth and a light that he could perceive clearly now as something natural to her, like the way some people simply carry themselves differently, but turned up significantly. Her eyes were large and grey and watching him with an intelligence that her composed expression tried to muffle. "I wasn't planning to enter," Harry said. "And yet you're staring at it. It's interesting. Do you mind?" He nodded at the goblet, inviting her to submit her own name if she was waiting. She looked at him for a moment, then moved past him to the goblet and dropped a folded slip of parchment into the flame. It flared very briefly, accepting, choosing, filing away, and she stepped back and turned to look at him. "You're Harry Potter," she said. His name in French inflection, the H swallowed, the vowels different. "I am," he agreed. "Last night," she said. "Something appealed to you." It wasn't a question. He met her eyes and found them direct and thoughtful and waiting for either honesty or deflection, and he could see she had experience with deflection, that most people deflected when she asked difficult questions, because engaging with her seriously was work that most people preferred not to do. "Yes," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected agreement. "What?" "Something that was blocking my magic broke," he said, keeping it clean and simple. "Your aura broke it. I don't think you meant to." A pause. Something shifted in her expression, not alarm, not the embarrassment of someone accused of losing control, but the particular feeling of having made an unexpected impact and not knowing exactly how to hold it. "My aura is not usually so forceful," she said carefully. "It was very forceful last night." "I know. I was nervous." She said it with the candid irritation of someone who resents their own body for having feelings. Large rooms. The performance. "I do not like performing." "That's interesting," Harry said, "because you were very good at it." She looked at him. He'd meant it as an observation, not a flattery, and somehow that had landed differently than flattery would have. You could tell the difference, she asked. Between doing something well and enjoying it? Yes. A beat. She looked at the goblet, then back at him. She was reassessing, he could see it happening, the quiet recalculation. These blocks, she said. They were put there deliberately. I believe so. By whom? He smiled. Not because it was funny, but because the directness of the question was so refreshingly uncomplicated after a lifetime of conversations that moved sideways around important things. The most powerful wizard in Britain, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and he watched her understand. The grey eyes moved briefly to the head table, where Dumbledore sat engaged in conversation with McGonagall, and then back to Harry. And you are not angry, she said. I'm completely furious, Harry said pleasantly. I'm just not going to do anything stupid about it. Something happened in her face then, something small and genuine, a loosening at the corners of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was the territory adjacent to one, like a person seeing something they'd stopped expecting to find. You are an unusual person, Harry Potter, she said. So I've been told. He looked at the goblet one more time, then at her. Good luck, he said. With the tournament. If the goblet picks you. When it picks me, she corrected, and there was nothing arrogant in it, just the flat confidence of someone who knows their own quality. When it picks you, Harry agreed. She walked away. He watched her go, not with the glazed, slightly stupefied attention that most of the boys in the hall were directing at her back, but with the clean interest of someone who had just had their first genuinely interesting conversation in quite a long time. He went back to his table and finished his toast. That evening, the great hall filled again for the selection. The mood was different from the night before, less performative, more electric, a room that knew something decisive was about to happen and was vibrating with the anticipation of it. The goblet had been burning all day, and now it was the specific blue-white of something that had made its decisions and was ready to announce them. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table. He had spent the day thinking, carefully and without urgency, about the shape of his situation, and he had arrived at the following set of conclusions. 1. He had not put his name in the goblet. 2. Someone else had. 3. That someone had either the extraordinary magical ability or the inside knowledge required to pass the age line. 4. The person most likely to have that combination of ability and motivation was not a student. 5. That meant an adult, possibly a Death Eater, certainly. Someone serving Voldemort's interests, which meant the tournament was a trap and Harry was the intended prey. These conclusions, pre-last night, would either have eluded him entirely or arrived slowly and partially, after damage had already been done. Now he held them cleanly, without the fog, and arranged next to them the logical follow-up questions: who was the adult, what was the trap exactly, and what was the end point supposed to be? He didn't know the answers yet. But he knew the questions, and the questions were most of the work. He watched Dumbledore with particular attention throughout the evening, and he watched Moody, because Moody was new and new things in the context of a trap were worth watching, and he watched Karkaroff, whose nervousness read differently through Harry's current perception than it would have the previous night, not just personality but active fear, the fear of someone who has made a dangerous commitment and is waiting to see if it comes due. The goblet flared. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts. The hall erupted, Hufflepuff loudest. Harry clapped, genuinely, because Cedric was decent and competent and had beaten Harry in a Quidditch match fair enough that Harry could respect it. The goblet flared again. Victor Krum for Durmstrang. Less surprise than acknowledgement, Krum was internationally known, 18 years old, already a professional athlete, and the kind of magical talent that made selection inevitable. The Durmstrang contingent stamped their feet. The goblet flared. Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons. She rose from her table with exactly the composure Harry had predicted she would have, unhurried, a slight inclination of her chin, completely prepared. The Beauxbatons table applauded. Some of the boys at other tables applauded with more enthusiasm than dignity. Fleur walked to the front of the hall and took her place beside Cedric and Crumb and didn't look at anyone in particular. Her eyes briefly found Harry's as she crossed the room. He nodded, fractionally, and she turned back to face the front. Dumbledore held up the goblet one final time. The flame had dimmed, it had made its 3 selections, the number it was designed for, and was settling into quiescence. Then it flared again. Bright. Unexpected. A bolt of flame that made the whole room flinch back, and from the conflagration came a scrap of parchment, still burning at the edges, spinning as it descended. Dumbledore caught it. Read it. The silence in the great hall was absolute. Harry Potter, Dumbledore said. The silence held for exactly 1 breath after the name, and then the room detonated. The noise was enormous: surprise, anger from some of the older students, the low agitated roar of a crowd that had just been handed something they didn't know what to do with. Harry sat still in the middle of it and felt the noise wash over him and thought, there it is. Harry Potter, McGonagall said sharply from the head table. Please stand. Harry stood. He didn't look at Ron, who had gone rigid beside him, or at Hermione, whose hand had gone to his arm and then fallen away. He looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked at him, and in those blue eyes Harry saw what he'd been waiting to see all evening, what the return of his ability to read those eyes allowed him to see now. Not surprise. Dumbledore had not expected Harry's name to come from the goblet. But he had not been surprised by it, either. He had been prepared for the possibility. Positioned for it. He had a next move, already built, already waiting. Harry could see the gears of it turning even now. He walked to the front of the hall, and as he passed the Beauxbatons table, Fleur Delacour watched him with those grey eyes, and he saw in her expression something that he thought was, under the composed surface, a deeply felt, oh, interesting. He reached the front of the hall. He stood. The noise was still enormous around him. Dumbledore's eyes moved from Harry to something Harry couldn't see yet, but which Dumbledore was apparently calculating carefully. Then the headmaster raised his hands and called for quiet, and the hall complied, as rooms always did when Dumbledore asked them to, and in the quiet, Dumbledore said, "The Goblet of Fire has made its selections. The Triwizard Tournament shall proceed." He said nothing about the irregularity. He said nothing about investigating how a 4th year's name had been submitted. He said nothing at all about how this had happened or what it meant. Harry noted all 3 silences. He was led with the other champions to a side chamber, Cedric looking stunned, Crumb looking curious, Fleur looking like she was holding several questions at tactical distance, and as Dumbledore followed them in and began to speak, the night rearranging itself into something official and procedural, Harry stood in the back corner of the room and felt the last, fading warmth of the 15 broken blocks settling into the new architecture of his mind, and he thought very carefully about what came next. He thought, someone wants me in this tournament. He thought, Dumbledore is going to manage this situation to serve his own purposes. He thought, the tournament is dangerous, and the threat at the end of it is real, and I am the only person in this room who knows I am a target. He thought, good. He thought, let them underestimate me, one last time. I know what I am now. He stood in the corner of the room and watched Dumbledore speak and Karkaroff argue and Bagman beam and Fleur's eyes slide sideways to find his, and he met her gaze with the calm certainty of someone who has just found out exactly what they're capable of, and he almost smiled. Chapter 2, The weight of what was taken. The champions' meeting broke up just before midnight. Bagman had done most of the talking, vibrating with the barely contained energy of a man who found other people's danger genuinely thrilling. Crouch had provided the official framework in the dry, clipped tones of someone reading from legislation he'd personally written. Karkaroff had argued about the 4th name for 20 minutes with the focused intensity of someone who had a great deal invested in the outcome and didn't want to say why. Cedric had stood next to Harry looking confused and decent, which was, Harry was beginning to think, Cedric's primary mode of being. Crumb had said almost nothing, but his eyes had moved around the room with the slow, assessing quality of a predator in new territory. Fleur had asked 3 precise questions, about the rules governing magical assistance, about the nature of the tasks, and about what the binding magical contract actually bound them to, and had received 3 non-answers wrapped in official language, and had accepted them with a composure that Harry read as, "I will find out myself." Dumbledore had said, "Harry, a word," as the others filed out, and Harry had said, "Certainly," and had stood in the middle of the room while Dumbledore looked at him with those ancient blue eyes and began to arrange his words with the care of a man who understands that the words matter. "You didn't enter yourself," Dumbledore said. "Not a question." "No," Harry said. "Do you know who did?" Harry looked at him. He kept his own expression exactly as open and direct as he would have kept it the previous night, before the blocks broke. He was doing Dumbledore the courtesy of not letting on how much had changed, partly because it was strategically sensible and partly because it was kinder. "Not yet," he said. "I have some ideas." Dumbledore's eyes moved across his face. Harry felt the gentle probe of legilimency, light as a finger on glass, and was mildly astonished to discover that he could feel it now. Could feel it and instinctively, without any training, simply redirect the surface, show Dumbledore the anxiety, the confusion, the 14-year-old boy who just had his name called in front of the whole school, all of which were real and all of which were a fraction of what was currently happening in Harry's mind. The probe withdrew. Dumbledore smiled the warm, sad smile. "You'll be careful," he said. "Won't you, Harry?" It was the thing that was almost a question and wasn't. Harry had heard it a dozen times and always felt, in its wake, the specific flavor of reassured resignation, the sense that being careful was both his duty and the sum total of what was expected from him. Now he heard it and recognized it for what it was, instruction. Containment. Stay in your lane. Trust the people who are managing this. Don't reach above what we've prepared you for. "I'll be fine," Harry said, which was not the same thing at all. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment, and then that small recalibration moved through the blue eyes again, the same one Harry had seen in the Great Hall, the one that said, "Something is different, and I'm not sure what it is," and then it was gone, buried under the warmth, and Dumbledore said, "Good night, Harry," and that was the end of the meeting. Harry walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the dark and thought about the legilimency probe and the fact that he deflected it without thinking. That was interesting. That suggested the capacity for occlumency had always been in him, dormant, and that the blocks Dumbledore had placed had been suppressing not just magical power but specific defensive abilities. He filed that away in the growing catalogue of things to examine when he had time. The portrait hole swung open. The Gryffindor common room was still lit, still full, and the roar that greeted his entrance hit him like a physical thing. Seamus was on a chair. Parvati and Lavender were shrieking. Even Percy, who had materialized from somewhere, was beaming with the particular pride of someone who considers someone else's achievement his own. The noise was genuine and warm and completely overwhelming, and Harry stood in the middle of it and smiled and said the right things, and beneath the smile he was already separating himself from it, not coldly but with the clear-eyed awareness that this was the surface of the situation and not the substance of it. Ron was not cheering. Ron was standing at the edge of the crowd, by the fireplace, with a look on his face that Harry had never fully been able to parse before and could now read without effort. It was the look of someone who has decided to feel something difficult and has decided simultaneously that the other person is responsible for it. Not jealousy exactly, that word was too simple. It was more like, I have spent 4 years being the person who is next to the interesting one, and I have told myself that's fine, and now I'm discovering that I actually mind. Harry crossed the common room. He sat in the chair across from Ron, and the noise swirled around them without really touching either of them, and he said, "Are you going to ask me if I put my name in?" Ron said nothing. "Because I didn't," Harry said. "You can believe that or not." Ron's jaw was set. "Why would someone else put your name in?" "Because someone wants me in the tournament. Someone who's not a well-meaning friend." Harry held Ron's gaze and made his voice level and not angry, because he wasn't angry at Ron, and he needed Ron to hear the words clearly and not through the filter of feeling accused. "The tournament is a trap, Ron. It's built around me specifically. Someone wants me in it because something bad is supposed to happen to me in it. That's the whole point. Ron blinked. Something shifted in his expression, the set of his jaw loosened slightly. You can't actually know that. I can make very good guesses. Harry paused. I need you to trust me. The common room was still celebrating around them, but in this corner, in this specific 2 feet of space, it was quiet and weighted, and Harry watched Ron work through it, the suspicion and the wanting to believe and the fundamental decency underneath both of them. Ron was not a bad person. He was a 17-year-old with a complicated set of feelings about his best friend's fame and an incomplete understanding of his own worth. Neither of those things made him a poor friend. They just made him a human one. Fine, Ron said at last, and it didn't have a lot of warmth in it, but it had decision. Fine. I believe you. Harry nodded. Thank you. Hermione appeared at his shoulder, appearing from the crowd the way she often did, slightly breathless, carrying a copy of magical contracts and their binding clauses that she had apparently retrieved from her dormitory in the 12 minutes since the meeting had ended. I've been reading about the binding contract the goblet creates, she said, without preamble, sitting on the arm of Ron's chair and opening the book in her lap. The language in the original text is interesting, it binds the entrant to compete, but the nature of what constitutes competing is ambiguous. Technically, if you complete each task and maintain a score, the contract is satisfied regardless of whether you're trying to win. I'm going to try to win, Harry said. Hermione looked up from the book. Oh, she said. It was a small sound, but it carried weight. He'd said it simply, without qualification, without the self-effacing backpedal she'd have expected from the Harry she'd known since first year, and she'd heard the difference. He watched her file it alongside the chicken leg moment from dinner and whatever else she'd been cataloging, and he watched her decide, with the decisive pragmatism that was one of her best qualities, to take it at face value and move on. Then we should understand the scoring system, she said, and turned to a new page. He spent an hour with them by the fire, which was a good hour, genuinely, the 3 of them working through what they knew about the tournament's history and structure, Hermione cross-referencing her way through 2 books, Ron providing a surprisingly detailed institutional knowledge of Hogwarts that came from 6 generations of Weasleys and their accumulated gossip. Harry contributed the strategic framing, asking questions that moved the conversation from trivia toward useful analysis, and he noticed that neither of them questioned his contributions. They just answered, because the contributions were good, and in the flow of a working conversation there was no space to wonder why Harry was suddenly different. He went to bed at 1 in the morning, and he lay in the dark after the other boys were asleep, and he did what he promised himself he would do when he had time. He went through the 15 blocks one more time. Not emotionally, he didn't have the luxury of the full emotional accounting yet, didn't have the space to feel the real size of what had been done to him. But he needed to understand the architecture of what they'd been before he could fully understand what he was now, so he did it methodically, the way he'd always done his best thinking in the quiet, in the dark, when no one was watching. Number 1 had been on his magical awareness, his ability to sense the currents and presence of magic around him. The block had been there since he was young, before Hogwarts, probably installed during one of Dumbledore's quiet visits to the Dursleys in the early years, in those brief moments when the headmaster had checked on his investment. The result was a boy who could do magic but couldn't feel it, who treated spellcasting as a mechanical exercise rather than an intuitive communication. He thought about Hermione's technical precision and how everyone assumed that was the best way to approach magic. He wondered, not for the first time, if Hermione had ever had a similar block, and then decided that was a thought for another time. Numbers 2 through 5 had been an interlocking cluster, emotional intelligence, self-worth, strategic thinking, and what he could only call ambition, though not in the Slytherin sense. The ambition to reach. The instinct to look at something difficult and think, I can do that. He thought about every time he'd faced something extraordinary and his first instinct had been to find someone else to solve it, not because he was lazy, but because some deeply installed voice had always said, this is beyond you, wait for a better person, you're lucky to be here at all. The voice was quieter now. Not gone, because some of it was real, the genuine humility of a person who knows they have things to learn. But the fraudulent part of it, the installed part, was quiet. Numbers 6 through 9 had been about his connection to other people, his ability to read them, to understand their motivations, to sense when he was being handled. He thought about every year's worth of Dumbledore's management and how thoroughly it had worked on a boy who literally could not detect that he was being managed. He thought about Snape, and how the rage Snape provoked in him had always felt disproportionate even to him, and recognized now that some of that rage was probably the blocked parts of himself responding to the contempt in which Snape held him, a contempt aimed at something real and perceived. Snape, whatever else he was, had always known that Harry was more than he seemed. The hatred had some knowing in it. Numbers 10 through 13 had been about power. The raw, structural capacity of his magical core, which had been compressed and channeled and carefully directed toward the minimum output necessary for a student who wasn't meant to outgrow his handlers. He sat with this one for a while, in the dark, listening to Neville sleep, and he felt the current state of his magical core, expanded now, enormous, a little unsettling in its size, and he thought, I've been casting magic at about 30% of my actual capability for 4 years. He thought, no wonder the spells always felt slightly effortful. He thought, everything is going to be different in the DA if, he stopped that thought. No DA yet. That was 2 years away, or wouldn't exist at all, depending on how things went. Numbers 14 and 15 he already knew. He left them for last because they were the biggest and the most personal. 14, the connection to magic as language, as relationship, as living thing, was the one that had changed the most about his moment-to-moment experience. He could feel the castle around him right now, faintly, the way you can feel a large animal's warmth from a few feet away. He could feel the dormitory's charms, the layered centuries of magic in Hogwarts stone, the wards that breathed in and out with the seasons. It was not loud. It was not distracting. It was just present, like peripheral vision, available when needed, quiet otherwise. 15, the manipulation detection, was the one that changed the most about his social experience. He sat with it carefully and thought about trust, which was something he needed to think about. The block's absence didn't mean he trusted no one, it meant he could now distinguish between his chosen trust and his installed trust. People he trusted because they'd earned it, and people he'd been shaped to trust by a system that needed him trusting them. He was not going to blow up his relationships over this. He was simply going to know what they were. He slept. Deeply, cleanly, without the low-grade unsettled anxiety that had been the texture of his sleep for 4 years. He didn't know that until the morning, when he woke before his alarm and lay in the sudden quiet and noticed its absence the way you notice a sound stopping. The morning was October 31st +1, November, grey and cold, the castle's windows sweating with condensation. Harry was first to breakfast, which had never happened before in his Hogwarts career, and he sat alone at the Gryffindor table for 10 minutes with a cup of tea in his thoughts and the Great Hall mostly to himself, and it was excellent. Cedric found him there. He dropped onto the bench across from Harry with the slightly too casual air of someone who has decided to do something and is pretending they haven't decided. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Harry said. "Right." Cedric wrapped his hands around a cup of tea and looked at the table. "Listen. I wanted to say, I believe you didn't enter yourself. I know most people are," he waved a hand, "but I've spoken to you 3 times this year and you're not the type." Harry considered him. Cedric was, he thought, genuinely good, not in the way that good-looking, popular people were sometimes called good as a compliment to their luck, but actually, structurally decent. He was not stupid. He was not vain. He was a year older than Harry and a better student than Harry in most subjects, and he had never, once, used any of that to make Harry feel smaller. That was rarer than it should have been. "Thank you," Harry said. "The tournament's going to be rough," Cedric said. "Probably. I don't have any problem, I mean, if you wanted to," he seemed to be wrestling with the syntax of what he was trying to offer. "Work together when it's useful," Harry said. "Me neither." Cedric looked relieved. "Yeah. That." He took a long drink of tea. "Crumb's very good." "I know. And the French girl is, Cedric paused, choosing words. She's serious. She's not here to be decorative. No, Harry agreed. She's not. Something in his tone made Cedric look at him sideways. You've spoken to her? Briefly. Cedric smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in it. She didn't freeze you out. She froze McLaggen out. Literally, I think there was ice involved. I think she can tell the difference between people who are talking to her and people who are talking at her. Cedric sat with that for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's probably right. He stood, gathering his bag as other students began filtering in. We should talk more. Later. Definitely, Harry said. He watched Cedric leave and thought, genuine ally. No calculation in it. File and keep. The Slytherin table was wearing Potter Stinks badges by mid-morning. Harry discovered this at breakfast's end, when Malfoy materialized out of the growing crowd wearing one and flashing it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has decided the best response to complicated emotions is a slogan. The badge flashed between Potter Stinks and Cedric Diggory as our champion in a kind of juvenile alternation that would have stung more, Harry thought, in the old configuration of his feelings. Now he looked at it and thought, Malfoy is 16 years old and trying very hard to believe he's important, and someone at home has taught him that contempt is the appropriate response to insecurity, and the badge is a symptom of all that, not a weapon aimed at Harry specifically. He thought, I genuinely feel a bit sorry for him. He said nothing. He walked past the Slytherin table and Malfoy made some comment about cheating and Harry didn't break stride, and he heard Malfoy's voice go slightly uncertain at the non-reaction, the pitch rising a fraction. Did you hear me, Potter? And Harry was already gone. Potions was first and Harry sat in it with the particular clarity of someone who can now feel what he already knew about Snape, that the man was brilliant, genuinely, in the way that sharp intelligence combined with total mastery of a subject produces a kind of ferocious competence that has nothing to do with kindness. He could feel Snape's magic now, in the adjacent way he could feel everyone's, complicated, layered, carrying something dark around the edges not because Snape was dark but because Snape had spent decades carrying darkness around as a professional requirement and some of it had gotten into the walls. Snape gave Harry a low mark for a potion that Harry was moderately certain was better than Draco's. Harry looked at the mark and looked at the potion and thought, fine, I don't actually need your validation to know this is good work. He finished his notes and moved on. The real event of the day happened after lunch, in a corridor outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, where he encountered Fleur Delacour, who was standing at a window looking out at the grounds with the deliberate stillness of someone thinking hard. She heard him coming and turned before he was close enough to have announced himself audibly. The Veela thing, he thought, the heightened awareness that came with it. She looked at him with the direct grey gaze and said, without preamble, I've been thinking about what you told me. About the blocks, he said. About the blocks, she confirmed. She turned back to the window. He came to stand beside her, not crowding, just adjacent, both of them looking out at the grounds where a few students were cutting across the grass toward the greenhouses. My grandmother told me, she said, that Veela aura at full strength can dissolve false constructs. Magical glamours, enchanted disguises. She said once that she walked past a man in Paris who was under a very powerful identity-changing curse, and when she came close the curse simply unwound. That's what happened to me, Harry said. But the blocks weren't glamours. No. She was quiet for a moment. They were something more sophisticated. I could feel the resistance, like pushing through something that was not supposed to be pushed through. It was not comfortable. She glanced at him sideways. For me, I mean. Was it? It didn't hurt, he said. It was like waking up. She held that for a moment. He could see her processing it, not just the information, but the implication, the weight of what it meant that something like that had been done to him and in what frame of mind the person who did it must have been. You are angry, she said. Not asking, reading him, the way she'd been reading rooms all her life because rooms had always been a challenge to navigate. Yes. He didn't see any point in denying it to her specifically. A controlled kind. That is the most dangerous kind, she said, and there was something in her voice, recognition, maybe, the tone of someone who knows what controlled anger feels like from the inside. Who manages yours? He asked. She turned to look at him fully, and the look was sharp and evaluating, and then, slowly, something that was closer to the honest side of her face. My father is, she started, then stopped. Started again. He is very concerned with the family reputation. With what the Veela blood means to people who don't understand it. He manages the impression very carefully. She paused. I have been selected to represent Beauxbatons partly because of my ability and partly because I look exactly like what people expect a Beauxbatons student to look like. Madame Maxime is not unaware of this. Harry nodded. He understood what she was describing, the use of a person's natural qualities as someone else's asset. He'd been living a version of it his entire life. Does that make you angry? He asked. A controlled kind, she said, and the corner of her mouth moved again, that almost smile. They stood for a moment in the corridor, and it was, Harry thought, a genuinely unusual thing, two people who had met roughly 36 hours ago in a room full of people trying to use them, standing in a corridor and being honest with each other. It was either very stupid or very sensible, and he'd always had trouble telling the difference. The tournament, he said. You know it's been interfered with. A fourth name from a school that submitted one champion, she said. Yes. The interference is aimed at me. Someone wants me in the tournament because of what they're planning for the end of it. She looked at him. The tasks will still be dangerous for all of us. Yes. I'm not suggesting otherwise. He met her eyes. I'm suggesting that we both have an interest in not being predictable. In not doing what we're expected to do. And what are we expected to do? I'm expected to stumble through 3 tasks by luck and instinct, get to the end, and get killed. You're expected to be the decorative Beauxbatons representative who makes a decent showing and doesn't win. The quality of her attention changed. It sharpened, went cooler, and he felt the temperature in the corridor drop a fraction in a way that was probably entirely his imagination and might not have been. Who expects that of me? She said, and her voice was very level. Everyone who looked at you last night and thought about your aura before they thought about your wand, Harry said. Which was most of the room. A beat. 2. 3. I am going to win this tournament, she said, and it came out very quietly, which was worse than loud. I know, he said. So am I. Those two things are only a contradiction if one of us doesn't reach the end, and I don't intend to let the people who rigged this decide whether I do. She studied him for a long moment, and he let her study him, because she was good at reading people and he had nothing to hide from her specifically. She was looking for something. He thought she was looking for the thing that most people didn't have when they spoke to her, the absence of a hidden agenda, the actual lack of the subterranean manipulation that almost every person who'd ever expressed interest in her was running. She seemed to find the absence. You are very strange, Harry Potter, she said. You said that last night. It remains true. She straightened, pulling her bag back onto her shoulder, the composed surface reassembling itself without any particular effort. I will be watching how you approach the first task. And I'll be watching you, he said. I would expect nothing less. She turned and walked away down the corridor, her silver hair catching the gray autumn light, and she didn't look back, and Harry watched her go and thought that she was someone who had never once needed to look back to know whether someone was watching. He was still thinking about it when he sat down in defense against the dark arts, which meant he was still slightly preoccupied when Moody thumped in and dropped something in a jar on his desk that turned out to be 3 small spiders, and Harry's newly acute magical senses touched the magic in the room and noticed something specific about Moody that snapped him back to full attention. Moody's magic felt wrong. Not evil wrong, not dark magic wrong. Wrong in the way that something familiar feels wrong when it's being performed rather than being real. Like hearing someone's voice when they're doing an imitation versus hearing the actual person, the notes were right but the resonance was off. Harry sat in his chair and looked at the gnarled, scarred figure at the front of the room and reached out carefully with his returned awareness and felt the wrongness sitting there like a stone in still water. There was magic running underneath Moody's surface. Old, skilled, controlled magic, maintaining something. A sustained enchantment of enormous complexity. Polyjuice potion didn't smell like anything, Harry thought. It didn't have a magical signature of its own. But the person underneath it did, their real magic, suppressed but present, like an accent that bleeds through no matter how good the imitation. Harry sat and listened to the lecture about the unforgivables and kept his face absolutely neutral and thought, that is not Alastor Moody. He didn't know who it was. Not yet. The magic underneath the disguise was, he reached for it carefully, quietly, without letting anything show on his face, dark-edged. Not the darkness of someone who had worked near dark things. The darkness of someone who had made their peace with dark things a long time ago and didn't experience them as dark anymore. Dedicated. Certain. Death Eater. He was sitting in defense against the dark arts class being taught about the unforgivable curses by a Death Eater who smelled of polyjuice and whose real magic sat underneath the disguise like an ember in ash. Harry breathed in. Breathed out. He took notes. He answered the question about the Imperious Curse with the correct answer delivered in the right register, confused, slightly disturbed, appropriately engaged. He did not let the Death Eater teaching him see anything that it would be useful for a Death Eater to see. He watched from behind his own face and listened and gathered. The Cruciatus Curse. The class reacted. Neville went grey. Harry didn't react much, which he was afraid might itself be notable, but Moody, not Moody, had moved on to the killing curse and was describing it with what Harry could now feel was genuine familiarity. Not the familiarity of someone who has studied a thing. The familiarity of someone who has used it. He thought, this person, whatever else they are, is competent. They know what they're doing. They are playing a long game. He thought, they are playing it for Voldemort, and the end of the game is the end of the tournament, and me. He thought, I know you're there, and you don't know I know, and that is the only advantage I currently have, and I am going to protect it. After class, the corridor. Hermione at his elbow, notebook open. The bit about resistance to the Imperious Curse was interesting, she said. There's almost no literature on resisting it from the victim's side, it's always framed as a prosecution defense. She paused. What did you think? I think the lecture was very informative, Harry said carefully. Hermione looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them, and he watched her file it, the specific flatness in his voice that she recognized as, I have a thought, it's not safe to share it here, and she closed her notebook and said, library, later. Definitely, he said. She found him there at 5, in a back corner table with a stack of books on tournament history that he'd been working through for 2 hours. She sat across from him and looked at the stack and said, the Goblet of Fire has chosen a 4th champion twice before. I know, he said. He'd found it 40 minutes ago. 1472, and 1603. In 1472, the 4th champion was later discovered to have been entered by an external party seeking to use the tournament as cover for an assassination. In 1603, it was a deliberate subversion of the process for political purposes, someone wanted the champion of a particular school to fail. Hermione was nodding. I found the same references. She looked at him. Harry. Someone is trying to kill me, he said. Yes. She sat with that for a second, the way she always sat with difficult things, she didn't look away, she didn't reach for a reassuring deflection, she just held it and thought. He'd always valued that about her. Who, she said. I don't know who put my name in, he said. I have thoughts about who they're working for. Voldemort, she said, without flinching, which was one of the things about Hermione that set her apart from nearly everyone else in the school. Voldemort, he agreed. Which means there's someone already here who's working the other end of it, someone inside Hogwarts who can steer the tournament in the right direction. That's, Hermione stopped. Started again. A teacher? Possibly. She looked at her notebook. Then at him. Then back at her notebook, and he watched her apply her intelligence to the problem with the ferocious systematic thoroughness that had always been her best weapon, and he thought, she's going to figure it out, and when she does, I'll confirm it. He didn't tell her about Moody yet. He wanted another day of observation first. He wanted certainty. He walked back to the common room that evening and found Ron waiting by the fire, clearly having sat there for a while, clearly having decided to say something and been rehearsing it. Harry sat down. Ron looked at the fire and said, "I'm sorry. About earlier." "You don't." "No, I do." Ron's jaw worked. It's stupid. You didn't enter yourself and I acted like, it's just always." He stopped. Started again. "You always have something happening. And I just stand next to it." Harry looked at him for a long moment. He felt, with his returned emotional intelligence, the full shape of what Ron was saying, not just the specific thing, but the years of accumulated context underneath it, the second son dynamic and the six brothers and the family legend of Harry Potter landing in Ron's life at 11 and immediately being more interesting. It was a real and legitimate feeling, and it wasn't Ron's fault for having it, and it also wasn't Harry's fault for being who he was, and both things could be true. "I need you to stand next to it, Ron," he said. "I actually do. Not because I need someone to carry my books, but because you're the person in this school who I trust completely, and I need that right now. Things are going to get complicated." Ron looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, the complicated thing simplifying into something more primary, the way Ron always worked best, on the simple and the felt rather than the reasoned. "Complicated how?" "Dangerous complicated," Harry said. "Voldemort complicated." Ron's face went through several stages. "Right," he said finally. "Right. Okay. I might need you to be my instincts when mine are occupied with other things," Harry said. "You're better at reading a room emotionally than either me or Hermione. That's useful." Ron blinked. He hadn't expected that. Harry watched the compliment land, not flattery, just the precise naming of a real quality, and watched Ron decide to believe it, because it was true and he could feel the truth of it. "Yeah," Ron said, slowly. "Okay. Yeah, I can do that." "Good," Harry said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire and felt the day settling around him, the information gathered, the connections made, the problems identified and arrayed. He felt the size of what was coming and was not afraid of it. That was new, too, and it was not bravado. It was the specific absence of the artificial smallness that had been installed in him, the absence of a floor placed too low. He had a sense of his own capability now, clear and real, and from that ground the upcoming tournament felt like a serious and difficult problem rather than an incomprehensible disaster waiting to happen. Outside the common room windows, the November wind moved through the grounds, pulling the last leaves from the trees by the lake and flinging them against the glass, and Harry watched them and thought about Fleur Delacour standing at a window thinking hard, and about the 15 blocks lying broken at the back of his mind like shed armor, and about the Death Eater in the defense classroom, and about the graveyard waiting at the end of the tournament for a boy who had been designed to stumble into it, and he thought, I am not that boy anymore. He turned back to the fire and let it warm him. Chapter 3, Wolves wearing Mentor's robes. November moved through Hogwarts like cold water through a crack, slowly, inexorably, finding every gap and settling in. The castle got darker earlier and the corridors smelled of damp stone and the lake turned a color that was less gray than the absence of all other colors. Harry noticed it all with the heightened awareness that had become his new normal, and he found, to his mild surprise, that he liked November. It had an honesty to it. No pretense of warmth. He'd spent the first 2 weeks of the month building a picture. Not dramatically, not with any of the confrontational energy that the old version of him might have channeled into the situation. He went to classes. He ate his meals. He laughed at Fred and George's jokes and helped Neville through the Transfiguration homework and sat across from Ron in the common room working through the past records of Triwizard tasks that Hermione had compiled into a remarkably comprehensive document she called Preparatory Analysis, Triwizard Tournament Historical Data, which both Harry and Ron had privately agreed to never call by that name. And while he did all of that, he watched. He watched Moody, the false Moody, with the careful, peripheral attention of someone who knows that the subject cannot suspect they're being studied. In class and in corridors, at the head table when he appeared at meals, from across the great hall when the teachers gathered for whatever passed for staff socializing. The Polyjuice enchantment sat under the surface of the disguise like a second heartbeat, slightly out of sync with the first, and Harry had quietly confirmed two things: it was being refreshed at least daily, which meant either an extraordinary supply of potion or a confederate providing it, and the magic underneath it was not just dark-edged but specifically, identifiably the product of someone who had worked for Voldemort for a long time. He'd also been watching Karkaroff. Karkaroff was afraid. Harry had recognized it on the night of the selection and daily observation had confirmed it, a cold, marinating fear that had nothing to do with the tournament specifically and everything to do with something Karkaroff was waiting for. He moved through the castle like someone listening for a sound in the walls. He flinched at loud noises. He watched the news, actual news, not Hogwarts gossip, with the intensity of someone checking for a weather report that had been threatening a particular kind of storm. Former Death Eater, Harry knew from fragments of memory, Karkaroff had testified against other Death Eaters in exchange for his freedom. Whatever protection that deal had given him was apparently something he was now not entirely confident in. The third thing Harry had been building was a training framework, and this was the most immediately satisfying of the three. He'd taken to rising at 5:33 mornings a week, before the dormitory woke, slipping into the castle's lower corridors where the early winter dark still held and the only sound was the distant movement of the castle adjusting itself. He'd found a room, not the room of requirement, which he was saving for something specific, but a disused classroom on the 4th floor that had been sealed for reasons no one current seemed to know and which Harry had opened in roughly 8 seconds, because the locking charm on it was an old one and old magic, he was discovering, spoke to him clearly. He'd been systematically working through what he could do. The first morning had been revelation, just him and a practice dummy he'd transfigured from a chair and his wand and the open space of his actual magical capability deployed for the first time. He'd run through his standard repertoire, Expelliarmus and Stupefy and Protego and the rest, and felt each of them land with a weight and a precision that was categorically different from anything he'd achieved before. Not louder, that wasn't quite it. More complete, like the difference between humming a tune and hearing it played by a full orchestra. Every spell he cast had been a fraction of what it should have been, for 4 years, and now the fraction was the whole thing, and the whole thing was considerable. He'd then tried spells he'd never managed properly. Corporeal Patronus, he'd done this before, the stag, but it had always felt like coaxing an engine to turn over in cold weather. Now it erupted from his wand with the cheerful inevitability of something that had been trying to come out for a long time, the stag massive and bright and so vivid that its light actually illuminated the room, and it looked at him with what he could only describe as relief, and dissolved. He'd tried spells he'd never tried at all. The summoning charm, Accio, which he'd always used for small objects, he tried it on the classroom stone benches and moved 112 feet, smoothly, with no particular effort, which told him several things about the first task that he'd been quietly suspecting. He tried nonverbal casting on a whim, on the 3rd morning, pointing at the transfigured dummy and thinking Stupefy without moving his mouth, and had been more than a little satisfied when the dummy had sailed backward into the wall with a crack that left a dent in the plaster. He was working on a specific spell now, one he'd found in a book from the restricted section that Hermione had procured with a combination of charm and sheer persistence. A spell for conjuring a shield that moved with the caster, that wasn't stationary like Protego but dynamic, responsive, a second skin of deflection. It was advanced magic, 6th or 7th year level according to the textbook. Harry had spent 2 mornings on it and was almost there, could feel the architecture of it becoming clear. He was thinking about this spell on the morning he arrived at the 4th floor classroom and found it occupied. Fleur was standing at the room's far end with her wand drawn, practicing something that involved a very compact, very controlled discharge of elemental magic, something silvery and concentrated that she was pushing from palm to palm without a wand, which was, Harry was fairly sure, not supposed to be possible for anyone who wasn't at least 3/4 Veela. She heard him at the door and turned, and her expression moved through surprise to something that recalibrated quickly to annoyance. "This is my room," she said. "I've been using it for 2 weeks," Harry said. I've been using it for 5 days. You were not here when I found it." She lowered her wand. The silvery thing between her palms dissolved. "How did you open the lock?" "Felt the charm and cancelled it." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I'll find another room if you want." She considered this with the direct practicality he'd come to expect from her. "The castle is not large enough for private training rooms. There are too many champions looking." She put her wand away. "We could share." "We could," Harry said. "You were not supposed to be here at," she checked a small watch on her wrist, 5:42 in the morning. "Neither were you." "No." Something at the corner of her mouth. "No, I was not." She looked at his wand and at the room. "What were you working on?" He told her about the dynamic shield. She looked interested immediately, not the polite interest of someone being courteous, but the quick, leaning-in interest of someone who recognizes a problem they've thought about themselves. "There's a variation in French defensive theory," she said. Bouclier vif. It requires the caster to anchor it differently. Instead of projecting outward you fold it inward first. Like clothing rather than a wall. "Show me," Harry said. She showed him. It took 3 attempts for her to demonstrate it cleanly and 2 more for Harry to understand the anchor point she was describing, a spot between the shoulder blades, of all places, some intersection of physical and magical proprioception that he had to find by feel. When he found it, the shield came up differently, and he stood in the middle of the empty classroom wrapped in something that moved when he moved, and he thought, yes. That's it. Fleur was watching him. "You learn quickly," she said. "I've had 5 years of material to uncompress," Harry said. She tilted her head. He'd said things like this occasionally over the past couple of weeks, oblique references to the blocks and their absence, and each time she filed them. "What does that feel like?" she asked. "The learning, now." "Like I've been reading with a finger over every 3rd word," Harry said. "And now I can see the full sentence." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My grandmother says Veela girls feel this when they come into their inheritance. She says it's like suddenly speaking a language you could only listen to before." She paused. "I don't remember when it happened for me. It was gradual." Harry looked at her. The early morning light was grey-blue through the room's high windows, and she looked different from this angle, less composed, less performed, the composed surface present but softer at the edges, the way people are at 5:42 in the morning before the day's armor is fully on. She was extraordinary, he thought, in the specific way that competence and clarity combined with genuine passion for a thing was extraordinary. She cared about this. She cared about getting better. That was, in Harry's experience, rarer than talent. "How long until the first task?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "And you don't know what it is?" "I have a theory." He'd had the theory since the night he'd moved the stone bench with Accio. "I haven't confirmed it yet." "Neither have I." She picked her wand back up. "And I don't intend to ask Madame Maxime." Harry raised an eyebrow. That surprised him, not that she wanted to do it independently, but that she was saying it out loud to him. That was trust, implied and unstated. "Because she'd tell you, and you don't want to know." "Because she'd tell me what to do about it," Fleur said. "And I don't want to be told what to do about it." She held his gaze briefly. "I think you understand this." "Very much so," Harry said. They trained together for an hour, moving around each other with the careful spatial awareness of 2 people who have both been in enough situations where someone else in the room could hurt them. They worked on different things mostly, Harry on the dynamic shield, Fleur on a combat-specific charm sequence that was elegant and economical and looked, when she ran it at full speed, like a conversation between the spells rather than a series of individual castings. Occasionally they overlapped, Fleur commenting on Harry's anchor point, Harry noting a moment where her sequence had a gap in it that he could see because he'd been on the other side of a sequence like that. She stopped. Looked at him. "Where is that gap?" she said. "Third to fourth casting. There's a half second where your wand crosses the midline of your body and you're not generating anything." She ran it again. Stopped at the third to fourth transition. Looked at where her wand was. Made a sound that was equal parts irritation and recognition. "I've been doing that for 6 months, she said. "Easy to miss when you're casting it," Harry said. "Obvious from outside." "Fix it," she said, not a question. "Push the fourth casting back a fraction and start generating it during the crossover rather than after. Your wand is moving anyway, use it." She tried it. Got it wrong. Tried it again. Got it right, and Harry felt the air in the room shift slightly when the sequence ran clean, a physical response to good magic that he could feel now and hadn't been able to before. Fleur ran it 3 more times and then lowered her wand and looked at him with the measuring, slightly assessing expression that he was coming to recognize as her version of being impressed. "Bon," she said simply. They packed up at 6:40 and went to breakfast separately, which was a practical decision and not at all a significant one, and Harry arrived at the Gryffindor table to find Hermione already there, reading, and Ron eating toast, and a folded piece of parchment at his place setting that had not been there when he left. He picked it up. It was written in unfamiliar, tight-looped handwriting on plain parchment with no signature. "The first task will include creatures of significant magical power. Your performance against them will be most instructive. One who watches." Harry read it twice, then held it over the candle flame until it caught and let it burn to nothing in the empty space beside his plate. "What was that?" Ron asked. "A clue about the first task," Harry said. Ron stared at him. "And you just burned it?" "I already knew," Harry said. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione the full extent of his theory yet, not because he didn't trust them, but because he wanted to confirm it first, and because there was a specific way he intended to confirm it that required him to talk to someone he hadn't spoken to yet about this particular topic. That conversation happened after dinner, when Harry tracked down Hagrid through a process of elimination that took him 20 minutes and ended at Hagrid's cabin, where he knocked and found Hagrid opening the door with the expression of someone caught doing something secret, which was basically Hagrid's constant expression. "Harry," Hagrid said, too heartily. "What are you, can I come in?" Harry said. Course. Hagrid stepped back, and Harry walked in, and he immediately knew he was right. The cabin smelled of something specific, something wild and reptilian and enormous that was not any of Hagrid's usual menagerie of semi-legal creatures. There were burn marks on the floor near the back door that hadn't been there the last time Harry had visited, roughly 3 weeks ago. He looked at Hagrid. Hagrid looked at him. "Dragons," Harry said. Hagrid's enormous face went through multiple emotions with the speed of someone who is both a bad liar and very aware of it. "I don't know what," he started. "Hagrid," Harry said, gently. "I can smell them." A pause. Hagrid deflated. "You weren't supposed to know." "I know." Harry sat down in the oversized armchair and stretched out. "How many?" "4," Hagrid said, miserable and also, Harry could see, trying to hold on to the excitement. "1 for each champion. There's a horntail, Harry, I've never seen one up close, what are we meant to do with them?" Hagrid's eyes widened. "I can't, Hagrid." A long pause. "Get past them," Hagrid said finally. "Each dragon is guarding something. You've got to get it." Harry nodded. He'd expected as much, the retrieval scenario, something the dragon was protecting. He thought about the summoning charm and the stone bench flying across the classroom, and thought, all right. "Good. Which dragon am I getting?" he asked. Hagrid stared at him. Harry, you can't tell anyone I won't, Harry said, and he meant it. Which one? Hagrid looked at the floor. Draw 4M the morning of the task. All 4 champions pick one. He looked up. Hungarian Horntail, Harry. It's the most, just be careful. Please. I'll be fine, Harry said, for the second time in as many weeks, and he meant it both times, and each time he meant it slightly differently, not with more confidence exactly, but with more ground under it. He thanked Hagrid and walked back across the grounds in the dark, and the night was clear and cold and the stars were out in the thousands, and he thought about dragons and thought about Fleur not wanting to be told what to do and thought about the Death Eater in the defense classroom and thought about the tournament as a whole, the shape of it, the structure of it, the long chain of events that led from this cold November evening to whatever was supposed to happen at the end, and he thought. I need to tell her. Not out of obligation. She'd find out herself, she was Fleur Delacour and she had already said she intended to. But he thought about the training room and the gap in her sequence and the bouclier vif and the quality of working alongside someone who took things seriously and treated you as an equal, and he thought, she deserves the advantage. He sent a note to the Beauxbatons carriage that evening via a school owl, brief and plain, 4 dragons. 1 per champion. Draw on the morning. First task is retrieval. No signature. He was fairly sure she'd know. In the morning he found a note at his place at breakfast. I know, it said. Then, below it, you should have seen your 6th to 7th casting transition yesterday. There's a gap. He looked across the hall at the Beauxbatons table. She was eating without looking at him, perfectly composed, her silver hair pinned up in something that looked effortless and had probably taken 8 minutes to construct. He looked back at his breakfast and tried to work out where the gap in his casting was. He found it 20 minutes later in charms. He revised it during lunch. He didn't mention it to her because she hadn't asked him to. Dumbledore called him to his office on the 14th of November. Harry had been expecting it. He walked up the spiral staircase with the unworried pace of someone going to a meeting they've prepared for, and he sat down in the chair across from the enormous desk and looked at the headmaster and waited, and Dumbledore looked back at him with those ancient measuring eyes and the warmth in them that was real and also useful, and for a moment neither of them spoke. How are you finding things, Harry? Dumbledore said. Fine, Harry said. A bit complicated. The position of 4th champion is unprecedented. The other champions are older than you. More experienced. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and Harry watched him decide between 2 approaches and choose the gentler one, which was itself information. I want you to know, Dumbledore said, that I am here to help you. In whatever capacity I can. I appreciate that, Harry said. He let the words sit without adding to them, and watched Dumbledore register the absence of what normally followed, the gratitude, the slightly overwhelmed relief, the readiness to be guided. He watched Dumbledore file the absence and choose not to address it directly. The tasks will be dangerous, Dumbledore said. I won't pretend otherwise. But there are people watching, the whole thing is overseen, regulated. You won't face anything alone. Harry looked at him. He thought about the 15 blocks. He thought about the Death Eater in the defense classroom and the graveyard that was supposed to be waiting at the end of this. He thought about alone and what it actually meant, and he said, I know. Dumbledore's eyes moved across his face again, and this time the probe of legitimacy was slightly more deliberate, not invasive, more like an extended hand, offering itself as an entry. Harry showed it the surface, the combat slightly stressed about the tournament face, the appropriate 14-year-old response to a headmaster saying encouraging things, and the probe touched it and found it credible and withdrew. One thing, Dumbledore said, setting down his half-moon glasses. You've been spending time with the Beauxbatons champion. Harry kept his face easy. We spoke a couple of times. Miss Delacour is an excellent witch, Dumbledore said. And she is also a competitor in a competition you're both bound to participate in fully. I know that, Harry said. I merely want to ensure that, Dumbledore paused, choosing, and what he chose was, that you don't allow personal feeling to complicate your priorities. Harry looked at him for 3 full seconds. He thought about what he wanted to say, and he chose not to say it, because the version of himself who was 3 weeks past the blocks and still establishing the baseline of how he intended to operate was not someone who tipped his hand to Albus Dumbledore over something this small. Instead he said, simply, I know what my priorities are. Dumbledore held his gaze. Something moved in those eyes, not displeasure, but something more like recalibration. The same small shift, the third time Harry had seen it. Dumbledore was building a picture of what had changed, and he was not sure yet what the picture showed. Of course, Dumbledore said, warmly. Of course you do. Harry stood, thanked him, and left. He was in the corridor outside the stone gargoyle when the anger came up properly for the first time, not the controlled kind, not the filed-away kind, but the full version, the one that lived at the bottom of the stack. Don't allow personal feeling to complicate your priorities. As though his relationship with another human being was a strategic liability to be managed. As though Dumbledore had the standing to advise him on that. As though the man who had spent 4 years narrowing Harry's entire inner world had the standing to say anything at all about how Harry used it now that it was his again. He stood in the corridor and breathed through it, in, out, and he let the anger be what it was and then he put it back in its place and walked on. The anger was information. He filed it. The training room the next morning. He told Fleur about Dumbledore's caution, because he told her the things that were relevant to both of them and this was relevant to both of them. She listened without interrupting, standing against the wall with her arms folded, and when he finished she said, he thinks we are distracting each other. He thinks I'm getting attached, Harry said. And that the attachment will make me manageable. Fleur's expression didn't change much, but her eyes went cooler. He thinks I'm a complication in your story, she said. Not a person with my own. I think that's the frame, yes. How familiar, she said, and it came out very dry and very tired, the tiredness of someone who has been a footnote in other people's narratives their entire life. You're not a complication in my story, Harry said. You're a separate story that happens to be running parallel. She looked at him. The cool in her eyes eased fractionally. That is a more sophisticated understanding of other people than most 14-year-olds manage, she said. I've been told I'm unusual. Repeatedly, I'm sure. She uncrossed her arms and picked up her wand. What are you doing about the dragon? Accio, he said. She blinked. Then she ran the logic, and he watched her reach the same place he'd reached and he watched the genuine appreciation of it cross her face. The golden egg, she said. Each dragon is guarding an egg. You summon it. The dragon is distracted. It'll still be angry, Harry said. I'll need the shield up and moving. The bouclier vif and Accio together. She nodded slowly. And if the dragon pursues? Then I improvise, he said. But I don't intend to be on the ground long. You intend to fly, she said. On my firebolt. He paused. If I can get to it. It needs to be summoned too. She thought for a moment. You could Accio the broom first, from the champion's waiting area. Then Accio the egg once you have the broom. She tilted her head. 2 summons, both non-contact, both from a distance. The dragon won't know what you're targeting. Harry held that. It was better than his version. That's cleaner, he said. She didn't acknowledge the compliment, just nodded and moved into her practice space and started her own sequence. She'd been working on something with fire, Harry had noticed, a way of using an Aglementi variation as a primary offensive tool rather than a defensive one, which was clever and specifically suited to the first task in a way that she wasn't going to tell him about and which he admired without asking. They trained in companionable parallel silence for 40 minutes. Then Harry said, "There's someone in this castle who's working against me." She stopped. Looked at him. Waited. Not a student, he said. A teacher. They've been placed here specifically for the tournament. Their job is to make sure I reach the end of it in a particular way, and then I get killed. A beat. Which teacher? She said. I can't tell you that yet. I need to be certain. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through the implications, for the tournament, for him, for the broader picture of what was happening at Hogwarts this year. Then she said, "Does Dumbledore know?" "I don't think he knows everything," Harry said. "I think he knows more than he's showing." "And you're not going to tell him?" "Not yet." She was quiet for a moment. "You are carrying a very great deal," she said, not with sympathy exactly, it wasn't pity, but with the direct recognition of one person identifying something real in another. "For 14 years old." 15, January, he said. 14, she said firmly. "Fair enough," he agreed. She turned back to her practice. "If you are killed," she said, conversationally, over her shoulder, "I will be quite annoyed." "I appreciate the sentiment," Harry said. "It is not sentiment," she said. "I've become accustomed to the early morning training. I would have to rearrange my schedule." Harry laughed, and it was a real laugh, the sudden, unexpected kind that comes from something catching you off guard, and it filled the room, and Fleur didn't laugh but the corner of her mouth moved in that specific way, and she turned back to her practice and said nothing more about it. He found Ron and Hermione in the common room that evening looking like they'd been waiting for him, with the specific guilty energy of two people who have been discussing something they're not sure they should discuss. Harry sat down and looked at both of them and said, "What?" "We might know what the first task is," Hermione said. "Dragons," Harry said. She stared at him. "How long have you known?" "A week and a half." She made the sound she made when she was simultaneously impressed and frustrated. Ron was grinning despite himself. "Why didn't you say?" Hermione asked. "I was deciding what to do about it." "And?" Ron said. "Accio," Harry said. "I summon the egg." Hermione went very still. "Then, yes. That would work. That's genuinely," she stopped. "When did you get so good at this?" Harry looked at her. It was the question he'd been waiting for, the one that had been accumulating since the chicken leg moment and the goblet side analysis and the potions observation and a dozen other moments when he'd been more than he'd always been, and he'd been deciding, over these 3 weeks, how much to say and to whom. He looked at Hermione, who was the most trustworthy person he knew when it came to information, and he looked at Ron, who was his best friend, and he made the decision. He told them. Not everything, not the specific number of blocks or Dumbledore's name attached to each one with certainty, but the substance of it, that something had been blocking his magical awareness and his processing for years, that it had broken during the champion selection ceremony, and that he believed it had been done deliberately by someone with the power and motivation to want him a specific, managed way. He watched their faces while he talked. Hermione's went through discomfort, horror, racing analysis, and then the specific expression of someone who is reviewing years of data through a new framework. Ron's was simpler, it went through shock, anger, and then the deep, warm, completely uncomplicated furious protectiveness of someone who loves you and has just been told someone hurt you. "Who?" Ron said, and his voice was very flat. "I have a strong suspicion," Harry said. "I don't have proof." "Harry, Ron." Harry held his eyes. "I need you to let me do this my way." Ron held the gaze. The protectiveness fought with the trust, and the trust won, barely, and Ron said, "Fine," in the same tone as the first time, not warm, but decided. Hermione was already 3 steps ahead, which was typical. "The blocks breaking would explain," she started and then stopped, looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, something older and more careful. "You've been different," she said. "Since the ceremony." "Yes," Harry said. "I didn't want to say anything," she said. "In case, it's fine," Harry said. "I'm still me." Just more of me. She looked at him. Then she nodded, and she accepted it with the same decisive pragmatism she always applied to difficult new information, and she turned to her notes and said, "Then we should talk about the defense teacher, because I've been cataloging something." Harry sat up. "What?" "Moody's teaching sequence," she said. "This year he's covered the unforgivables, tracking curses, long-range hexes, containment charms, and evasion theory. In that order." She paused. "That's not a dark arts defense curriculum. That's a tournament-specific curriculum. Every topic directly prepares someone for a specific scenario." She looked at Harry. "And every scenario is the kind of scenario where the teacher would know in advance what the student was going to face." The room was quiet. The fire crackled. "Inside knowledge," Harry said. "Access to the tasks," Hermione said. "Or to the person designing them." "Or both," Ron said. Harry looked at the fire. The last piece of the Moody picture slid into place, not just the polyjuice, not just the dark magic underneath the disguise, but the specific function, the deliberate curriculum, the positioning of the false teacher as a handler preparing the champion for the trap at the end. Not killing Harry at Hogwarts, the tournament was too visible for that, too watched. Preparing Harry for death at the end of it, making sure he had just enough preparation to reach the finish line and not enough to survive what waited there. He thought, "They've been using the defense lessons to both prepare and to monitor me." He thought, "Every time I showed something in that classroom, they were watching and reporting." He thought, "I've been showing them too much." He thought, "Starting tomorrow, I start showing them less." "Don't perform in defense," he said quietly. "Either of you. Answer correctly, but don't demonstrate anything exceptional. Average work only." Hermione looked pained but nodded. Ron looked confused and then complied. The first task was in 8 days. In those 8 days, Harry finished the bouclier vif until he could raise it between one breath and the next. He ran the Accio sequence in the training room, broom first, then egg, both from 60 feet, both non-verbal, until it was as automatic as walking. He worked with Fleur in the mornings and with Ron and Hermione in the evenings, and he slept well, and he ate normally, and he moved through the castle with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done their preparation and is ready for what comes. On the morning of the task, he came down to breakfast and found the great hall buzzing with the particular electric excitement of a school about to watch something dangerous happen to people it knows. He sat at the Gryffindor table and ate eggs and toast and drank his tea, and from across the hall, Fleur met his eye for exactly 1 second. She looked composed and sharp and absolutely ready. He nodded, fractionally. She looked away. Dumbledore stood and spoke about the task, the timing, the scoring system, and Harry listened and watched and thought about nothing except the next few hours. He felt the tournament's binding contract sitting around him like a second skin. He'd been feeling it for weeks now, the old magic of it, its intention and its weight, and he felt his own magic in response to it, not resisting but present. Awake. Here. Bagman came to collect the champions from the waiting tent with his usual beaming performance, and Harry went, and in the tent he stood with Cedric and Crumb and Fleur, and none of them spoke very much because there was nothing much to say. Fleur stood nearest to Harry, by chance or not, and she was perfectly still and looking at the tent's entrance with an expression that was a door closed on everything except the next thing. Cedric was nervous. Good nervous, the kind that performs. Crumb was what Crumb always was, still water over deep current, impossible to read. Bagman returned with a velvet bag containing miniature dragons, and they each drew, and Harry looked at the tiny Hungarian horntail snarling in his palm and thought, "Hello. I've been expecting you." He closed his fingers gently around it. He thought about the Accio sequence. He thought about the bouclier vif wrapped around his shoulders like the world's most effective coat. He thought about his firebolt, the way it fit in his hand, the speed of it, the way it responded to intent. He thought, "I am ready. I am completely ready. Let's go." Chapter 4, Dragon Fire and Honesty. Cedric went first. Harry could hear it from inside the tent, the roar of the crowd that had assembled on the hillside above the enclosure, the deep reptilian bellow of the Swedish shortsnout when Cedric entered its territory, and then the sustained, breathless noise of several thousand people watching someone navigate something that could kill them. Cedric was in there for 11 minutes. Harry knew because he counted. The tent smelled of crushed grass and canvas and something metallic that was probably nerves made physical. Crumb sat on a crate in the corner with his arms on his knees, staring at the ground in the specific way of an athlete entering a pre-competition state, not absent, just interior. Fleur stood near the entrance with her back to it, and Harry noticed that she'd undone whatever had been holding her silver hair pinned up and it was loose now, and he thought that was either a stylistic choice or a tactical one, and given everything he knew about Fleur Delacour, he leaned toward tactical. She caught him looking. He held her gaze without the question in it, just waiting, and she said, "The aura is stronger with my hair down." "That's a weapon," he said. "Everything is a weapon if you use it correctly," she said, and turned back to face the entrance. He couldn't argue with that. The crowd sound shifted, a collective exhale that meant the dragon had been dealt with, then applause, then the announcement of Cedric's score, which Harry couldn't quite make out through the canvas but which sounded respectable from the reaction. Then Fleur's name, called from outside, and she straightened, and without looking at Harry she said, "Wish me luck." "You don't need it," he said. She walked out. The noise that greeted her entrance was different from Cedric's, a particular quality to it that Harry recognized immediately as the sound of a crowd reacting to something visually arresting before they'd processed anything else. And then the Welsh green bellowed and the crowd's tone shifted to the concentrated, anxious attention of people watching a serious competition, and Harry listened and thought about Fleur moving through her sequence, the precise, elegant chain of her casting, the gap in the third to fourth transition that was no longer there, the silvery Veela quality that she'd now deliberately amplified. It took her 7 minutes. The crowd was loud at the end of it, louder than for Cedric, and Harry heard the scores announced and heard the collective reaction and smiled at the inside of the tent. She'd done well. She'd done very well. Crumb went next. His style was, from the sound of it, brutal and effective. There was a period of roughly 90 seconds where the Chinese fireball made a noise like the world ending, and then a long silence, and then a tremendous roar of crowd approval. Crumb was back inside the tent in 8 minutes, and he looked at Harry as he passed and gave a single, brief nod that contained more collegial respect than most people managed with full sentences. "Potter," Bagman called from outside. Harry stood. He walked out of the tent and into the November air and into the noise, and the noise was enormous, thousands of people packed onto the hillside above the enclosure, students and teachers and the tournament's external judges and the ministry officials and the crowds who'd apparently apparat from all over Britain for the occasion. The sound hit him and then fell away to something background, because the Hungarian horntail was directly in front of him and it had raised its head and was looking at him with the flat, amber, completely impersonal gaze of a creature for whom he was both intruder and potential meal. It was bigger than he'd understood from the miniature. The miniature had suggested size. The actual horntail imposed it, 40 feet of scaled, spiked, genuinely prehistoric animal, crouched over its nest of eggs with the proprietary stillness of something that had never in its evolutionary history encountered a problem it couldn't solve by burning it. The spikes along its tail were each the length of Harry's arm. The smoke curling from its nostrils was black. Harry assessed it the way he'd been practicing assessing things, quickly, completely, without letting urgency crowd the analysis. The horntail's nest was in the center of the enclosure. The golden egg was in the nest, distinguishable from the others by the glint of it between the horntail's scaled feet. The chain securing the horntail to the rock face on the far side of the enclosure was 40 feet long, which meant the dragon had a 40-foot radius of unrestricted movement centered on the nest. He was currently standing at roughly 60 feet. He raised his wand. Accio Firebolt. He didn't shout it, didn't put performance into it. He said it with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who has done this 60 times in a cold classroom at 6 in the morning, and the firebolt answered with the obedience of a well-made thing responding to genuine authority. He felt it coming before he heard the crowd react to it, felt its approach through his extended magical awareness. And then it was in his hand and he was on it and airborne in a single motion that had no gap between its parts. The horntail's head swiveled. It tracked him. He'd expected that. Dragons had extraordinary visual acuity, and a moving target triggered a pursuit response that was essentially hardwired. He let it track him, climbing higher, watching the dragon's neck coil back in the specific anatomical preparation for a fire burst, and then he was up and gone, rolling sideways off the prepared trajectory, and the fire came through where he'd been, not close but warm, and the crowd made a noise that was part horror and part exhilaration. He circled. The horntail followed him with its gaze, which was what he wanted, attention up, on him, away from the nest. Accio golden egg. This one he said internally, non-verbal, and he aimed it with his whole magical awareness, the way he'd learned to aim things over the past 3 weeks, not just pointing the wand but directing the intent through it. He felt the spell hit the egg from 60 feet up and felt the egg's resistance. It was heavier than a normal egg, not physically but magically, and then the resistance gave and the egg was moving. The horntail felt it. That was the thing about creatures who'd been guarding something their entire life. They felt the absence of the guarded thing even before they saw it. The dragon's head snapped down, away from Harry, to find the egg rising from the nest, and in that split second of redirection Harry was already diving, already down, already threading between the horntail's attention and its egg and catching the golden egg one-handed 20 feet above the ground while the horntail swung its enormous head back toward him with a velocity that made the air pressure change. The fire came while he was still close. Not a full burst. The horntail was restraining itself slightly for reasons that had to do with the egg being in proximity, some protective instinct modifying the offensive one, but enough, a hot lateral gust that Harry met with the bouclier vif already raised, already moving, wrapping around him like water around a stone. He felt the heat on the other side of it and then he was up and away and the crowd sound was overwhelming and he had the egg. He landed. The enclosure's observers were already moving to resettle the horntail, and Harry stepped out of the arena onto the grass outside and stood there for a moment with the golden egg in his hands, feeling the tournament's magic acknowledge what he'd done, a warm, impersonal confirmation, old magic completing a phase. He was breathing hard but cleanly, the deep easy breathing of someone whose body had been doing exactly what it was trained to do. The time announcement came, 3 minutes, 41 seconds. The crowd noise was extraordinary. He looked up at the judges' table and saw the scorecards going up. 9. 10. 9. 9. 10. The perfect 10 was from the independent judge, a which he didn't recognize. Karkaroff had given him a 4, which he'd expected. Dumbledore had given him a 9. Total, 47. Joint first with Crumb. He was still looking at the scores when he felt eyes on him, not the general crowd attention, which he'd learned to filter, but specific eyes with specific weight. He turned his head. Dumbledore was watching him from the judge's table, and the expression on the headmaster's face was not the warm pride that Harry had been designed to seek. It was something older and more complicated than that, something that was working very hard at being warm pride and not quite succeeding, underneath which Harry could see the thing it was covering, recalculation. The recognition of something unexpected, something that didn't fit the model. Harry looked back at him steadily and then looked away. He was walking toward the medical tent, mandatory check, regardless of injuries, when the first person reached him. Not Ron or Hermione, though he could see them pushing through the crowd behind the barriers. Not Cedric, who gave him a genuine thumbs up from 30 feet away. Not any of the expected people. Fleur was standing at the edge of the enclosure, having apparently taken the most direct possible route from the spectator area to where Harry was walking, and he almost stopped, which would have been embarrassing, but he managed to maintain his pace. She was looking at him with an expression that had none of the composed surface operating at all. It was the open version of her face, the pre-armor morning version, and in it was something bright and specific and completely genuine. 3 minutes 41, she said, when he reached her. 7 minutes flat for you, he said. That sequence clean. Perfectly clean. She fell into step beside him, which was either unconscious or decided, and he wasn't going to examine which. The summoning was elegant, she said. I didn't think about the broom first. I would have been on the ground. The shield is your patent, he said. I'd have been burned without it. She made a small sound that was approximately a compressed version of satisfaction. They walked in companionable silence for 3 steps, and then she said, "You weren't afraid." "I was paying attention," Harry said. "It's similar." She looked at him sideways. "Most people, when they say they are not afraid, they mean they are afraid and they are managing it. You mean something else." "I knew what I was doing," he said. "I'd prepared for exactly this. The fear comes from not knowing what's about to happen, and I knew." He paused. "Also, the dragon was genuinely enormous. I had an appropriate amount of respect for it." "That is a very sensible relationship with fear," she said, and there was something in her voice that made the words more personal than they sounded. "What about you?" he asked. "A beat. I was nervous before. Not during." She looked ahead. "During, I was only doing the thing." "That's the best state," Harry said. "Yes," she said simply. The medical tent. Pomfrey was inside, working her way through the champions with brisk professional calm. Cedric had a burn on his forearm that was being handled. Crumb had a more serious eye injury. The fireball had apparently fired closer than intended and some of the blast had gotten through his shield. Pomfrey tutted and worked and sent them all away in short order. Harry had nothing. Pomfrey checked him over twice, slightly suspicious about the absence of damage, and he submitted to her examination with patience and came away clean. When he came out of the medical tent, the afternoon had shifted into early evening, the grey November sky going darker at its edges, and the crowd was dispersing back toward the castle. He found Ron and Hermione waiting a few feet from the tent entrance with the specific quality of people who have been having difficulty standing still for the past 20 minutes. Ron grabbed his arm first. "Mate," he said. "Mate." He didn't seem to have words beyond that, which was its own kind of eloquent. "You were brilliant," Hermione said, and her voice was entirely free of qualifications, which from Hermione was higher praise than 3 paragraphs of specific compliment. She looked at him with the warm, slightly shaken expression of someone who has just watched a friend do something that reframed how they understood the friend. "The broom first, Harry, that was the cleverest reading of the situation I've seen in 4 years of watching you in crisis situations." "I had 8 days to think about it," Harry said. "Most people would have spent those 8 days worrying," she said. He shrugged, and the 3 of them fell into step toward the castle, Ron still making occasional sounds of inarticulate approval. The grounds were crowded with people moving in the same direction, and fragments of conversation reached Harry as he walked: his name, the dragon, the time, the scores, comparisons with Crumb, questions about the 4th champion phenomenon resolving itself in his favor. He noticed something had shifted in the way people looked at him. Not the celebrity look, which he'd had since he was 11 and which he'd always found uncomfortable and faintly absurd. This was different. This was the look that people gave you when they just watched you do something competent and dangerous and were reassessing accordingly. It was less adoring and more respectful, and he found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't mind it. He did mind the Potter Stinks badges, which were still being worn by a significant contingent of Slytherins, but even those felt less targeted now, more like background noise, the kind of petty institutional contempt that says more about the wearer than the target. He walked past a cluster of them without acknowledging the badges and without the old instinctive flinch, and he heard them recalibrate behind him, uncertain how to escalate against someone who genuinely wasn't reacting. Dinner was louder than usual. The Gryffindor table was celebratory, not with the slightly overwhelming group embrace energy of last night's common room, but with the genuine warmth of people who are pleased that someone they know did well. Fred and George appeared at his elbows simultaneously, each draping an arm over his shoulders, and launched into an impromptu dramatic recreation of the dragon task that involved Fred playing the horntail with more enthusiasm than accuracy and George providing commentary that was funnier than anything Bagman had managed all afternoon. Harry laughed, genuinely, and ate his dinner, and was present and warm in the middle of it all. He also, across the great hall, watched Moody. The false Moody was watching him with the specific quality of attention that Harry now recognized immediately, not the general professional observation of a defense teacher monitoring a student champion, but something tighter, more evaluating, with an analytical edge to it that kept returning to the same question, working it over. Harry could almost hear the question from 30 feet away: how much does he actually know, and where did it come from? He kept his own face cheerful and slightly overwhelmed with the attention, which was the appropriate face for the situation and which had the additional benefit of being approximately what the false Moody expected to see. After dinner, the common room. The party that erupted there was unavoidable, and Harry let it happen around him, moving through it with genuine warmth, winning and losing several games of exploding snap, listening to Seamus's retelling of the task that improved with each iteration. At some point Fred placed a butterbeer in his hand and he drank it and watched the fire and let himself be simply in the room, in the evening, in the uncomplicated aftermath of having done something difficult and done it well. Ron dropped into the chair beside him around 9, when the party had softened to its later, quieter stage. "You all right?" he said. "More than," Harry said. "You?" Ron grinned. "Watching you fly over that thing." He shook his head. "It looked, I don't know. Different. You looked like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I did," Harry said simply. Ron looked at him for a moment. "You know what's weird? That's the first time you've ever said something like that without immediately following it with, probably, or, I think, or, I mean, I might be wrong." Harry smiled. "I know." Ron was quiet for a moment, digesting this. Then, "Good," he said, and took a long drink of his butterbeer. Hermione came to find them at 9:30 with a book, which was predictable, and with an expression that said she had been thinking about something since dinner and had arrived at a conclusion. She sat on the floor between their chairs with the book on her knees and said, "I've been thinking about the golden egg." Harry had not opened the golden egg yet. He'd put it in the dormitory and come down to dinner and let the evening be the evening. "And," he said. "The clue inside it is for the second task," she said. "The second task is always in February, which gives you 3 months. Which means the clue is probably encoded, not straightforward." She paused. "The egg, when you open it, apparently makes a sound. A dreadful sound, according to historical accounts. Screaming, or something like it." "Underwater," Harry said. She looked up sharply. "What?" "The sound's encoded for underwater," he said. "The second task has historically involved water, the Black Lake. The screaming would be decipherable if you were submerged." He met her eyes. "I've been reading the historical records." She stared at him. Then she made the sound again, the frustrated impressed one, and turned to her book and said, "I had to read 4 chapters to get there." "I got lucky with the index," he said. She gave him a look that said she didn't believe that for a second, and he didn't press it. He went to bed at 10 and lay in the dark and listened to the castle settle around him, feeling the particular quality of a day well used winding down. The dragon was done. First task, done. 47 points, joint first. He had 3 months until the second task and he knew its medium already, and he had an advantage in his own preparation that no one looking at him from outside would have anticipated 3 weeks ago. He thought about the egg. He thought about the Black Lake, which was cold and very deep and full of things that were not entirely comprehensible. He thought about what the second task would require that the first hadn't: sustained endurance rather than explosive response, navigation rather than evasion, a different kind of intelligence. He thought about Fleur, and the way she'd looked at him with her face open after the task. He thought about 3 minutes 41 said in that specific tone. He thought about walking beside her in the evening air and the quality of the silence between them, which was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. He thought, "I'm not going to do anything about that right now." He thought that was probably the sensible position, and also that the sensible position was slightly harder to maintain than he'd have preferred. He slept. The morning arrived grey and damp, and Harry found, at breakfast, a note from Cedric asking if he wanted to meet to compare notes on the egg. He wrote back, "Library, 11. He found Crumb watching him from the Durmstrang table with the considering gaze of someone who has upgraded their estimation of a person and is deciding what to do with the upgrade. He ate his eggs and toast and drank his tea. Fleur arrived at the Beauxbatons table while he was eating, and she sat down and her table moved around her the way it always did, the small choreography of people adjusting to a presence, and she caught his eye across the hall and looked at him with a completely neutral expression and then looked at her breakfast, and he looked at his breakfast, and the interaction was so aggressively unremarkable that Hermione, who had been watching the exchange peripherally, made a sound into her pumpkin juice. What? Ron said. Nothing, Hermione said, in the tone that meant several things. The note arrived at 11:15, not from Cedric but from Dumbledore's office, on school parchment with the headmaster's seal. Harry read it at the library table where Cedric was also sitting, and the content was what he'd expected, a request for Harry to attend a brief meeting after dinner to discuss his performance in the first task and his preparation for the second. Cedric watched him read it. Headmaster, he guessed. Yes, Harry said. He called me in last week, Cedric said. Wanted to know how I'd prepared. Very charming about it. He paused. Charming in the specific way where I left feeling grateful and didn't remember exactly what I'd told him. Harry looked at him. Cedric said it without apparent suspicion, more like a puzzled observation, the kind of thing you notice and file and don't know what to do with. What did you tell him? Harry asked. Cedric thought about it. Honestly? I'm not completely sure. I know we talked about my approach to the task. I think I talked about my preparation methods. He looked faintly troubled. He's very easy to talk to. Too easy, maybe. Yes, Harry said. He is. Cedric looked at him properly for the first time in the conversation. You don't trust him, he said. Not accusingly. Harry thought about how to answer that. He thought about what was fair to say to Cedric, who was decent and not part of any of this except as a fellow involuntary participant. I trust some of what he says, Harry said. I just don't assume that what he says is everything he knows. Cedric held that for a moment. He was, Harry thought, smart enough to recognize the significance of it and careful enough not to ask for more than was offered. Right, he said. Okay. He opened his own copy of the historical tournament records on the table. Should we talk about the egg? They talked about the egg for 2 hours, and it was genuinely useful. Cedric had a different knowledge base than Harry, more thorough grounding in magical theory, and between them they reconstructed the logic of the clue fairly quickly. The underwater medium they'd both arrived at independently. The lake they'd both suspected. There'll be something taken from each of us, Cedric said. The historical accounts suggest, someone, not something. Someone each champion cares about, held underwater somehow, and we have to retrieve them in an hour. Harry felt the specific cold of that. Not fear, operational concern. Someone taken. Someone he cared about. He thought about Ron, about Hermione, about Sirius. And if we don't retrieve them in time, he said. The accounts are vague, Cedric said. But the implication is that they're held in stasis and the hour is a competitive window, it's not actually fatal. He paused. I think too, Harry said, and neither of them sounded entirely reassured. That evening's meeting with Dumbledore lasted 20 minutes. Harry went in and sat down and was charming in the specific way of someone who understands the game being played and is choosing to play it back without rancor. He talked about his preparation, enough to seem open, not enough to reveal the training room or Fleur's contribution or the systematic magical study he'd been conducting. He talked about the egg in the appropriately uncertain terms of a student who hadn't fully decoded the clue yet. He watched Dumbledore listen, and he watched Dumbledore gauge, and he saw the moment when the headmaster decided that Harry was not fully concealing anything significant, because Harry was not, by nature, a skilled performer, and Dumbledore had decades of reading people, and the most convincing way to present partial information was to genuinely believe it was complete, which Harry did not. There was a delicate balance being struck in this room, and Harry was finding the edge of it by feel. The legitimacy probe came again, softer this time. Harry showed it the anxiety about the second task, the genuine uncertainty about the underwater approach, the real warmth he felt toward Dumbledore that coexisted with everything else. The probe touched and withdrew, and Dumbledore smiled and said something about the merits of the school library, which Harry understood was a gentle redirection toward an approved research method. He said goodnight. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower. He stopped in a corridor halfway there when he heard footsteps that had been pacing him for 2 minutes, not threatening, just present, someone walking the same route and making no effort to hide it. He stopped. Turned. Moody, the false Moody, was 20 feet behind him, emerging from the shadow of a doorway with the uneven, thumping gait that was as much a costume as the scarred face. The magical eye swiveled toward Harry and fixed there, and Harry felt the surface of the gaze against his own awareness like a cold hand against warm skin. "Good work today," Not Moody said. The voice was always the most convincing part of the disguise. Polyjuice got the physical right, but voice was more than anatomy, and whoever this was had spent a long time learning Moody's cadence. The summoning was clever. "Thank you," Harry said. He stood still and kept his face open and let the false Moody look at him with the magical eye, which he was aware could see through certain things. He didn't know the eye's full range, but he kept his surface clean regardless. "You prepared," Not Moody said. "More than anyone expected." "I had 8 days," Harry said. "Constant vigilance," Not Moody said, and there was something in the delivery that was slightly off, not the word, but the frequency underneath it, the way it vibrated with an irony that the real Moody would never have applied to his own dictum. "Absolutely," Harry said pleasantly. Not Moody looked at him for a long moment, and Harry felt the magical eye doing something, probing, sweeping, looking for something specific. He held still and thought about absolutely nothing of any significance and waited, and after 10 seconds Not Moody nodded and said, "Get some rest," and walked away. Harry watched him go, and when he turned the corridor, Harry released a breath that he'd been keeping very still. That had been a test. Not a dramatic one, no threats, no dark magic, nothing that would leave any kind of mark. Just a skilled operative running a calibration on an asset they were uncertain about. He thought, "You're wondering how much I know." He thought, "I'm going to keep you wondering." He turned and walked the rest of the way to the common room, and the portrait hole swung open, and the warmth of the fire came out to meet him. Ron was alone in the common room, reading something with the intense expression of someone fighting the material. He looked up when Harry came in. "Hermione left you notes about the egg," he said, pointing to the table where a stack of parchment was arranged with Hermione's characteristic organizational clarity. "She said she's worked out the full water-breathing problem. There's something about gillyweed, and also something called the bubblehead charm, and also a third option that she put a question mark on that I couldn't read." Harry picked up the top sheet. The handwriting was dense and thorough, and he read it in 2 minutes and said, "Gillyweed. Yeah. Most efficient. Reliable duration. Natural transformation rather than charm work, harder to interfere with if someone's trying to counter your preparation." He put the parchment down. "Hermione's right. She usually is." Ron made a sound of complete agreement. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire the only sound, the common room empty around them. "Moody stopped me in the corridor," Harry said. Ron went still. "And?" "Nothing specific. Watching me." Harry looked at the fire. "He's been watching me since the task. Recalibrating." "Should we?" Ron started. "Not yet," Harry said. "We watch back. We build the picture. When I know everything I need to know, we decide what to do." He glanced at Ron. "The person inside that disguise is very dangerous. The worst thing we could do is alert them that we know." Ron was quiet for a moment. "How do you know there's someone inside the disguise?" Harry had told them Moody felt wrong, that there was something false in his magic, without going into the specific mechanism. He held Ron's gaze now and said, "I can feel it. Magic has a texture, Ron. Everyone's is different. Moody's is layered. There's something underneath what's on the surface. Ron absorbed this. The blocks, he said. Yes, Harry said. Before, I couldn't have noticed. Now I can. Right. Ron turned back to his reading, and then turned back to Harry. I trust you, he said. About the Moody thing, and about all of it. Just so you know. Harry looked at him. The firelight was warm and the common room was quiet, and Ron was looking at him with the simple, durable certainty of someone who has decided how they feel and doesn't need to make a production of it. Thank you, Harry said. I mean it. Yeah, Ron said. I know you do. 3 days later, Hermione came to breakfast looking like she hadn't slept, which from Hermione was a particular combination because she usually looked not only like she'd slept but like she'd reviewed the night's dreams for their academic content. She sat down and put her bag down and said, I know who it is. Harry looked at her. Tell me quietly, he said. She leaned across the table and said, very quietly, the name that Harry had already arrived at through his own route but which he'd wanted her to reach independently, to confirm through a different kind of intelligence than his, Bartemius Crouch Jr. Silence. Ron stared at her. Harry looked at the table. He was a Death Eater, Hermione said, almost inaudibly. Sentenced to Azkaban. Son of Bartemius Crouch Sr. She pressed her lips together. I can't prove it. But the pattern of Moody's behavior, the curriculum, the access to tournament information, and Crouch Sr.'s involvement in the organization of the tournament, his strange absences, he's providing the polyjuice, Harry said, very quietly. She stared at him. You knew. I suspected Crouch Jr., Harry said. I hadn't worked out the supply chain as cleanly as you have. She looked at him steadily, and he could see her assembling all the pieces she had, the blocks, the changed Harry, the systematic preparation, and now this. He watched her arrive at the full picture and he watched her hold it with the same still clarity she brought to everything that mattered. Harry, she said. This is Voldemort. Yes, Harry said. She breathed. Then, what do we do? We keep building the picture, he said. And we make sure that when the third task comes, I'm ready for whatever's at the end of it. He looked at both of them. And we don't tell Dumbledore. Not yet. Hermione looked like this cost her something. Ron looked at Harry and then at Hermione and then back at Harry. Why not? Hermione asked. Because Dumbledore will decide what to do with the information, Harry said. And Dumbledore's decision will be about the larger picture, Voldemort, the Order, the war. My life will be one factor in that calculation. I need to be ahead of the calculation, not inside it. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture, the silence of three people standing at the edge of something large, assessing it together. Hermione said, all right. Harry looked at her. All right? All right, she said again, firmer. We do it your way. She picked up her pumpkin juice. But I'm going to be exceptionally stressed about it. I know, Harry said. That's useful. You make better contingency plans when you're stressed. She gave him the look. He smiled. Ron buried his face in his hands to hide the fact that he was laughing. Across the great hall, at the Beauxbatons table, Fleur was eating her breakfast with the composed unhurried quality that Harry had come to recognize as her default surface. As though she felt his attention she looked up, and across the space between the tables and the noise and the morning and everything else, she looked at him with those gray eyes, and there was something in them that was warm and direct and completely unguarded. He looked back the same way. Ron, who had recovered, looked between them and then at his toast and said, with great diplomatic restraint, absolutely nothing. Chapter 5, The Lake and What Lives Below. February arrived the way it always did at Hogwarts, as though November had simply never stopped, the cold just finding new ways to be cold. The lake had developed a skin of ice at its edges that cracked and reformed each morning, and the grounds were the particular colorless gray of a landscape that has forgotten what it's like to be anything else. Harry had spent 3 months learning to breathe underwater. Not literally, not yet. Hermione had sourced gillyweed from a contact at the apothecary in Diagon Alley, a transaction that had involved 3 owls and a level of negotiation that suggested Hermione had missed a calling in diplomacy. The gillyweed was in his dormitory trunk, wrapped in a damp cloth in a sealed jar, looking like something that had washed up on a beach and been there for a week. He'd read everything he could find about it, the transformation, the duration, the physiological specifics, and he understood it the way he understood the Bouclier VIF and the Accio sequence, completely, from the inside out. He had also spent 3 months thinking about the second task-specific problem: someone taken. Someone he cared about, held in the lake, to be retrieved within an hour. He'd done something about this that Ron had thought was either brilliant or insane, and Hermione had declared was both. He'd gone to Dumbledore and, in one of their regular post-task meetings, mentioned casually that he was worried about the second task's potential impact on people close to him, framing it as the appropriate anxiety of a student champion, nothing more. He'd watched Dumbledore receive the information and file it, and he'd thought, if you're planning to use Ron or Hermione as the taken person, you'll feel better about it now that I've unknowingly confirmed they're the obvious choice. And then, because he needed to cover this from both sides, he'd talked to Ron and Hermione and told them exactly what he suspected, so that when they were taken, if they were taken, they'd know beforehand, and the knowing would make it easier. Ron had said, "So you're saying I might spend an hour underwater?" Harry had said, "In stasis. You won't feel it." Ron had said, "I don't love this." Harry had said, "I know." Ron had said, "Fine. Okay. Fine." Hermione had simply written down the specific physiological facts about the stasis enchantment and annotated them until she was satisfied with the safety parameters, which took 40 minutes and 3 reference books and left her looking significantly calmer. He'd thought about other people too. Sirius, who was in some unknown location and who Harry had been in contact with by owl all year. He'd written to Sirius the week after the champion selection, a long letter that had taken him 4 drafts to get right. He'd written the first draft still partially in the old mode, instinctively minimizing, and had caught himself halfway through the second paragraph and started again. The final letter had been direct and complete: the blocks, what he now knew about them, his suspicions about Crouch Jr., his plan for the tournament. Sirius had written back in 6 hours, which suggested he'd been waiting by the Olary, and the letter had been the warmest and most real thing Harry had read from an adult in 4 years, because Sirius had not tried to manage him at all. He'd said, "This is exactly who I always knew you could be. Tell me what you need and I'll do it." He'd said, "I'm coming to Britain. I'll be near." Harry had written back, "Not yet. Stay safe. I'll tell you when." He thought about Fleur. This was harder to think about clearly, and he'd noticed that the difficulty itself was information. He'd been spending 3 mornings a week with her in the 4th floor classroom since November, and the training had evolved in the way that things evolve when 2 people are both getting better. The sessions were longer, more complex, more genuinely competitive in the way that equals push each other. She'd shown him 3 things in 3 months that he would not have found without her: the Bouclier VIF, a counterhex for water-specific magic that was standard Beauxbatons curriculum but not taught at Hogwarts, and a method of magical sensing under low-visibility conditions that she'd developed herself and hadn't shown anyone else. He'd shown her the nonverbal casting framework, the dynamic Accio application, and something he'd worked out in December about extending a shield's duration by routing it differently. They talked while they trained. About the tournament, mostly, and the strategy of it, and the political subtext of it. She was sharper on the European ministry politics than he was, and he was sharper on the Hogwarts-specific landscape, and the combination was genuinely useful. But they talked about other things too. He'd told her about the Dursleys, once, in the flat conversational way of someone who has processed something enough to describe it without needing it to be received a particular way, and she'd listened without offering sympathy he didn't need and without moving on too quickly, and at the end of it she'd said, "People warehouse children who inconvenience them. It happens in very different ways in very different places." He'd asked what she meant and she told him about being sent to a boarding school at 9 because her Veela inheritance had become visible and her father's law colleagues were uncomfortable. Not abusive. Just, efficient. He'd said, "I understand," and she'd said, "I know you do," and they'd both gone back to their practice. The morning before the second task, he came to the fourth floor classroom at 5:30 and found her already there, which was the norm now, and she was standing in the middle of the room with her eyes closed and her hands loose at her sides, not practicing anything, just standing. He came in quietly and she opened her eyes at the sound of him and looked at him with the direct, open version of her face. "Nervous?" he asked. "A controlled kind," she said. He almost smiled. "Do you know what's been taken from you?" he said. He'd been thinking about Fleur's taken person since November and had arrived at the conclusion that it would be Gabrielle, her younger sister, who had come with the Beauxbatons delegation and who Fleur regarded with a fierce, watchful protectiveness that she kept very quiet and that Harry had noticed because he was the kind of person who noticed fierce, quiet things now. Something moved in her face. "Gabrielle is missing from the carriage this morning," she said. "Since last night." "She'll be fine," Harry said. "The stasis is safe." "I've read I know it's safe," Fleur said, and her voice was controlled and the control was costing her something. "She is 8 years old and she is underwater in a lake and I know it is safe and I am still." She stopped. Harry crossed the room and stood in front of her. He didn't reach for her hand or say something reassuring that would be slightly off the mark. He just stood there, close enough that she wasn't alone in the room, and said, "I'm going to make sure she comes out of that lake." Fleur looked at him. Her eyes were very direct and slightly bright. "You don't know that," she said. "I know that I'm going to try with everything I have," he said. "And I know what I have now." She held his gaze for a moment. Something settled in her expression, not peace exactly, but a different kind of tension, a resolved rather than an unresolved one. "Gabrielle likes dragons," she said. "She's going to be extremely annoyed that she missed the first task." "Tell her about it," Harry said. "Use hand gestures." The corner of Fleur's mouth moved. She breathed, and the full width of her shoulders came back, and she looked at him and said, "If you find her before I do, tell her I said." She paused, "Tell her I'll bring her a souvenir." "What kind of souvenir do you get an 8-year-old from an underwater lake?" Harry said. "She'll want a Grindylow, probably," Fleur said. "She collects terrible things." Harry laughed, and she laughed briefly too, and they stood in the grey February pre-dawn and let it be what it was for a minute before moving back into the work of the day. They didn't train that morning. Instead they sat on the floor of the classroom side by side, backs against the wall, and went through the Black Lake's known contents, cross-referencing what Fleur knew from Beauxbatons' creature studies with what Harry had read in the Hogwarts library. Grindylows, they both knew. Mere people, almost certainly, the lake had a colony of them. Deeper down, things that the textbooks described with the academic vagueness of authors who hadn't been entirely sure what they were looking at. Cold currents that moved unpredictably in winter. "The mere people won't help," Fleur said. "No. But they shouldn't actively obstruct either, the tournament rules bind the task environment to a competitive standard." He paused. "The Grindylows are the real-time problem. If they cluster, fire is useless underwater," she said. "But force isn't," he said. "A nonverbal reductor, wide-angled. Clears a corridor." She thought about this. "You'll be fast," she said. "Faster than me, probably, you know the lake better." "I'll find Gabrielle if I find her first," he said. He said it without condition or negotiation and she accepted it the same way. They parted at 7:15, earlier than usual. Harry went to breakfast and ate a normal amount of food and sat with Ron and Hermione, and they talked about nothing in particular. Hermione had taken to keeping the conversation deliberately low stakes in the mornings of task days, which was a kindness she'd never explicitly offered and which he appreciated without mentioning. Ron ate a remarkable amount of toast and occasionally made eye contact with Harry with the expression of someone who is in a situation that is genuinely strange and has decided their job is to be steady about it. At 9, Harry walked to the lake. The crowd had gathered on the banks, the same scale as the first task, several thousand people, though the staging was different. No arena walls here, just the open shore and the cold grey water and the tournament officials standing at a row of tables with the weighing of wands formality that tournament events apparently required. Bagman was at a conjured podium near the water's edge, beaming, his voice carrying across the wind, "Ladies and gentlemen, the second task of the Triwizard Tournament." Harry stood with the other champions and looked at the lake. The surface was dark and still and very cold, and below it the water dropped away quickly into depths that were nearly lightless in February. He felt the lake's magic, older than Hogwarts, older than almost anything he'd been able to perceive, a slow and vast and fundamentally indifferent presence that had been here since before this was a school and would be here long after. He found the gillyweed in his pocket and held it, getting used to the weight of it. Cedric looked composed. He'd told Harry, 2 days ago, that he was using a bubblehead charm, his water-breathing solution, and Harry had said good choice and meant it. Krum was doing something with a partial transfiguration, apparently, which was technically astonishing and extremely Krum. Fleur was standing at Harry's left and not looking at the water, looking at the horizon, her jaw set and her hands still. Bagman counted down. Harry put the gillyweed in his mouth. It tasted the way he'd expected it to taste, like something that had never been intended for consumption, green and briny and textured in an unsettling way that he got through by focusing on the sensation of his lungs clearing and his hands beginning to change and the cold air suddenly feeling insufficient in a way that made the water look necessary rather than threatening. Gills opened on his neck, he felt them, the strange alien sensation of breathing through a mechanism that hadn't been there a minute ago. His feet were different. He looked at his hands, webbed, just slightly, the fingers longer and strangely efficient. The whistle blew. Harry walked into the lake. The cold hit him and didn't matter. That was the strangest thing about the gillyweed transformation, not the visual changes but the way the water stopped being wrong. He went under, and the lake received him, and the surface closed above his head, and he was moving. Dark water. Cold, very cold, the kind of cold that would have been paralyzing without the transformation. Instead it was just the medium, the pressure and the current and the green-black visibility that opened up slightly as his eyes adjusted in the way the gillyweed text had said they would. He kicked, and his webbed feet propelled him with an efficiency that he didn't have on the surface, and he went down and forward and let his magical senses extend around him in the way he'd been practicing for months. The lake was vast and it was alive and it was watching him in the same way a forest watches, not with eyes, with the collective attention of a thing that knows its own territory and registers what doesn't belong. He found the current lines, the paths that the lake used to move its water, the channels of least resistance, and angled himself along the deepest one, heading northeast toward the area where his research had suggested the Mere People colony was centered. He passed a cluster of Grindylows at 3 minutes in. They moved toward him in a coordinated, current-reading way of creatures that hunted cooperatively, and he assessed them, 7, 8, too many to dodge past cleanly in this visibility, and brought up the bouclier vif one-handed while the wand was already moving through the wide-angled reductor. The spell went out as a flat, expanding circle of force and the Grindylows scattered, not injured, just displaced, sent tumbling away from his path like leaves in a sudden wind. He was past them before they reoriented. For minutes in, 15 minutes in, time moved differently in the lake, the silence and the pressure flattening it. He found the first sign, a woven structure hanging from a rocky outcropping that was too deliberate to be natural, decorated with shells and dark weed in a pattern that his instinct recognized as territorial marking before his brain caught up. Mere People. He went toward it. Not cautiously, he didn't have the time for cautious, but with his wand visible and his movement telegraphed, the way you approached someone else's territory when you wanted to communicate intent. He found a merperson watching him from 30 feet away, gray-skinned, sharp-featured, holding a trident with the relaxed grip of someone who knows they don't need to be threatening because they're home and you're not. Harry stopped. He made a gesture he'd read about in the Hogwarts, a history supplementary on the lake's inhabitants, open hand, wand pointed down, a specific orientation that translated roughly as, "I'm here for the tournament thing, not for trouble." The merperson looked at him for 5 seconds, then jerked its head to the left. Direction. "Thank you," Harry said, and the sound came out strange and bubbled underwater, but the merperson's expression shifted fractionally, and he moved in the indicated direction. He found the rock. It was a formation in the deepest part of the accessible lake, where the light was almost nothing and Harry navigated by magical sense as much as vision. 4 figures floated in the stasis enchantment, bound to the rock by weed that glowed slightly with the magic keeping them under. He reached them in 17 minutes flat, which by the historical task records was fast. Ron. Hermione. A girl he didn't know who was presumably Cedric's person. And Gabrielle. He went to Ron first and cut the weed with a slicing charm, quickly and efficiently, and Ron floated gently in the stasis and then drifted upward as the enchantment released, not waking, still under, but free and beginning the slow pull toward the surface that the stasis design apparently built in, buoyed by the tournament magic. Harry watched him start to rise and turned to Hermione and did the same, and she rose after Ron, both of them ascending toward the light in a long slow spiral. He looked at the girl he didn't know. Cedric's person. He looked at Gabrielle. He thought about the task rules. 1 person each. He thought about Fleur in the dark-windowed classroom saying she is 8 years old in the controlled voice that was costing her. He thought about the logistics. Cedric was behind him, he'd felt Cedric's magical presence somewhere above and to his left, approaching but not here yet. He cut Cedric's person free. He cut Gabrielle free. Both of them began to rise. He followed them up, staying below in case anything interfered on the ascent. Grindylows had regrouped somewhere to his right, he could feel them, but they didn't engage this deep, they seemed to have a territorial boundary and he'd apparently crossed back out of it. The light increased as they rose, green and diffused, and then brighter, and then the surface was above him and he broke it in a burst of cold air and noise. The shore crowd was huge and loud and he oriented immediately to the bank. Ron and Hermione were already at the edge, tournament officials reaching for them, both starting to surface into wakefulness with the confused, slow blinking of people coming out of stasis. Harry moved to Gabrielle and kept a hand on her as they both came in toward the bank, the little girl starting to blink and look around at the gray sky and the enormous lake and the crowds and the fact that she was very wet. She looked at Harry and said something in French. Harry said, "Your sister said to tell you she'll bring a souvenir." Gabrielle blinked. Then, in accented English, she said Grindylow. She said souvenir, Harry said. I implied Grindylow. She didn't deny it. Gabrielle considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old processing very important information. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. Harry helped her to the bank. Tournament officials took over, blankets, warming charms, the organized care of a well-run magical event handling its competitors' welfare. Harry sat on the bank's edge with the cold February air doing its best and the water running off him and his gillyweed transformation beginning to reverse, the gills on his neck closing, his hands returning to their normal configuration. He'd been under for 21 minutes. He looked up at the bank. Fleur was coming out of the water 30 feet away, and her expression before she saw her sister was the open version of her face amplified, all the controlled surface gone, something raw and fierce underneath, and then Gabrielle ran toward her across the pebbled bank and Fleur caught her and the expression on her face was the kind of thing that Harry thought was private in the best possible way. He looked away. He sat on the bank and let Pomfrey do her check and let the tournament officials ask their questions and let the scores be announced, 47 again, joint first with Crumb, both of them having retrieved their people in the fastest times. Fleur had been delayed, Grindylows, apparently, a large cluster that had held her up significantly, and she'd come up without Gabrielle and arrived at the bank to find her sister already there, and Harry watched her understand what had happened and watched her look across the crowded bank at him with an expression that was open and direct and completely unguarded. He didn't make a production of it. He lifted one shoulder slightly, a small acknowledgement, and went back to cooperating with Pomfrey's diagnostic charm. When the official proceedings had finished and the crowds were starting to break up and the tournament officials were packing their tables, Fleur came to find him. She stopped in front of him and said, "You freed Gabrielle." "I was already there," he said. "You were already there and you freed Gabrielle and Cedric's person," she said. "Despite the rules." "The rules say I compete," Harry said. "I competed. I also decided that leaving an 8-year-old at the bottom of a lake when I had a free hand was not something I wanted to do." He paused. "The points deduction will probably be about 10. 7, she said. "I heard Bagman discussing it." 7, then. She looked at him. The lake wind was cold and she was wrapped in one of the tournament's emergency blankets and her silver hair was down and wet and she looked, he thought, more real and more herself than she ever did in the composed, armored version. "Thank you," she said. "For Gabrielle. She's delightful," he said. "She wants a Grindilo." "I know. She's been asking for 2 years." Fleur sat down next to him on the bank, which he hadn't expected. Not the sitting down, but the proximity, close enough that the emergency blanket she was wearing touched the sleeve of his robes. "She also told me you made her laugh," she said. "Which no one at this tournament has done for her. She finds most people here terrifying." "The lake thing, maybe," Harry said. "Perhaps." A pause. "She said you seemed like someone who was used to doing difficult things." Harry looked at the lake. The surface was quiet again, the disturbance of the task settling back into its usual grey flatness. "She's perceptive," he said. "She gets it from her grandmother," Fleur said. They sat on the bank for a few minutes longer than was strictly necessary, with the cold wind and the dispersing crowd and the grey water, and neither of them said anything more, and it was the kind of quiet that Harry had stopped trying to fill. Dumbledore found him that evening. Not in his office, in a corridor, which was unusual. The headmaster was walking in the direction of his tower room when Harry came around a corner from the library, and the encounter had the precise timing of something that wasn't accidental. Harry clocked it immediately and kept his face easy and said, "Headmaster." "Harry." Dumbledore fell into step beside him, unhurried, his robes whispering on the stone floor. "Excellent performance today. Your approach to the task was inspired." "Thank you," Harry said. "The decision to free Miss Delacour's sister, and Mr. Diggory's young man, was generous," Dumbledore said. "Though it cost you 7 points." "I didn't mind the points," Harry said. A pause. They walked. "You've been spending a great deal of time with Miss Delacour," Dumbledore said, in the tone of a man raising a subject he has been planning to raise. Harry said nothing. He'd found that silence, in conversations with Dumbledore, was one of the most useful tools available. "She is a remarkable young woman," Dumbledore continued. "Her abilities are considerable. Her character, from what I've observed, is admirable." He paused. "It is also the case, Harry, that she is the champion of a competing school. Her interests and yours are, in some respects, aligned, but in the final reckoning, the final task," Harry said. "In the final task, yes, each champion competes alone. The bonds formed during the tournament have historically been a source of complication." Harry stopped walking. It was a small, unhurried stop, he just ceased moving, and Dumbledore took 2 more steps before registering the absence and turning. They looked at each other in the corridor's torchlight, and Harry thought about everything he wanted to say and chose the part of it that was both true and necessary. "Sir," he said, and his voice was even and clear, "I've noticed that you raise the subject of Fleur in our meetings. I've noticed it 3 times now." Dumbledore held his gaze, and something moved in those eyes, the small recalibration, larger now than it had been the previous times, as though the accumulated weight of these moments was building towards something Dumbledore hadn't yet been able to name. "Each time," Harry said, "the framing is about my priorities, or my distractions, or the competitive nature of the tournament. Each time, the implication is that she is a problem I should be managing." He paused. "I want to say very clearly that I don't think of her that way, and I'm not going to. The corridor was quiet. Torchlight moved. That's not my concern, Dumbledore said, gently. My concern is for you. I know, Harry said. I believe that. And I'm telling you, with the same honesty I hope you'd want from me, that your concern in this specific area is, not necessary. I know what my priorities are. I know what's coming at the end of this tournament. I know it better than most people in this building think I do. He let that sit for 2 seconds. Fleur Delacour is not a complication. She's a person, and she's been more useful and more honest with me this year than most people who've claimed to be looking out for me. The silence stretched. Dumbledore looked at him, and Harry looked back, and the thing that moved through the headmaster's expression now was not recalibration. It was something older and more complicated, the particular pain of someone who has managed a situation with great care for a long time and has just been told, simply and without cruelty, that the management has been seen. Not all of it. But enough. You remind me, Dumbledore said, very quietly, of your mother. She also had a precision with words that was entirely her own. Harry felt the compliment land in a complicated place, because it was genuine, he could feel the genuine in it, and the genuine made everything harder and also more true. Thank you, he said. I have not always, Dumbledore stopped. Started again. I have made decisions in your life, Harry, that I made with the certainty that they were right. I am less certain of that now than I once was. Harry looked at him. This was the closest to acknowledgement he'd yet heard, and he thought it was costing Dumbledore something real, not the admission that he'd been wrong, because Dumbledore still believed in the framework, still believed in the greater good, still believed that the boy in front of him had always been a piece on a board whether Harry knew it or not. But the admission that the certainty was imperfect. That was real. I know, Harry said. I know you believed what you were doing was right. A beat. And now? Dumbledore asked. I don't want to have this conversation in a corridor, Harry said. And I don't want to have it before the third task. After, when this is finished, yes. We should talk. Properly. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the nod was not the paternal, slightly condescending acknowledgement of a wise man accepting a child's timeline. It was the nod of someone recognizing in equals terms. After, he said. Harry nodded back. He walked on. He felt Dumbledore's eyes on his back for 20 feet, felt the headmaster standing still in the corridor and watching him go, and he didn't look back. He found the training room the next morning and Fleur was already there, and she was working on something new. He could tell by the concentration, the experimental quality of her movements, the specific tilt of her head when she was developing rather than refining. He came in and sat against the wall and watched her work without interrupting, which was something they'd established in the first weeks, the right to develop in parallel without unchosen commentary. After 10 minutes she lowered her wand and said, "There's a corridor defense for the maze." "The third task is a maze," Harry said. He'd pieced this together from 3 different sources, none of which had been Hagrid this time. The grounds south of the castle, the large flat area that was currently warded, the scale of the ward and its specific magical signature said enclosed space, complex navigation, continuous magical environment. I've been working on maze-specific problems too. What problems? Disorientation charms, he said. Mazes historically use them to prevent champions from building a mental map. They shift the corridors. I've worked on that, she said. There's a way to anchor yourself magnetically, not compass north, magical north, the underlying directionality of the wards, and navigate by anchor rather than visual. He straightened. Show me. She showed him. It took him 30 minutes to find the magical north of the room, the underlying directionality of its own wards, a faint but persistent pull that existed independently of any visual reference, and when he found it the sensation was like catching a thread in the dark, unmistakable once you had it, invisible before. I didn't know you could do this, he said. My grandmother taught me, she said. Navigation by magical current. It's Veela knowledge originally. Veela migrated across Europe for centuries before anyone was keeping records. You need to know where north is when you're in a forest and the stars are covered. Your grandmother taught you a lot, he said. She taught me the things my father didn't want me to know, Fleur said, and there was something in it that was matter-of-fact and also underneath that was something older, something kept carefully quiet. She said I would need them. Harry looked at her. She was facing away from him, making some adjustment to her wand grip, and her expression was the closed one, but the closure was recent. She'd said something she hadn't entirely meant to and was now deciding whether to continue. He waited. She is the one who told me about the blocks, Fleur said. After the selection ceremony. I wrote to her and described what had happened, the aura, the resistance, the breaking. She wrote back and said, that boy has been caged. She turned. She said, be careful of people who cage things. They believe the cage is kindness and they are always very certain. The room was very quiet. Harry thought about that. He thought about a woman he'd never met, in France somewhere, who had understood in one description what had been done to him and had named it clearly and without drama. He thought about Fleur choosing to tell him this, and he understood that she was telling him something about herself as well, about her own cages, the boarding school at 9, the father who'd managed her carefully, the school that had selected her for her appearance as much as her ability. She sounds extraordinary, he said. She is, Fleur said. You would find her frightening. Almost certainly, he agreed. She looked at him with those grey eyes in the morning light, and the warmth between them was present in the room the way warmth was present in the training room when they'd been working for an hour, not from any specific source but accumulated, real, the product of sustained proximity and mutual regard. Harry held her gaze and let it be what it was, which he'd been doing for 3 months and which was getting progressively more complicated to do without acknowledging aloud what it was. She said, after the third task. He blinked. What? You said to Dumbledore, after this is finished. She had clearly been there in the corridor, or had very good sources, and he wasn't even surprised. After the third task, she said again, and her voice was level and warm and entirely direct, you and I should also have a conversation. A different one than we've been having. Harry looked at her. His first instinct was to say something, a question, a clarification, something to fill the space, and he caught the instinct and let it go, and instead he said, yes. Good, she said, and picked up her wand and went back to her practice. He sat against the wall for a moment longer and thought that he had, for the first time in his life, something genuinely and specifically worth surviving the third task for. Not just the abstract survival instinct, not just the responsibility of the broader situation, not just the people who needed him, all of those were real and they mattered, but this. A conversation. A specific person, saying, after this, I want more of this. He pushed off the wall and raised his wand. The third task was in 3 months. He had 3 months to finish the preparation. He thought about Barty Crouch Jr. in the defense classroom. He thought about the graveyard that was waiting at the end of whatever the maze led to. He thought about Voldemort, specifically, and without the filtered, managed terror that the blocks had partly sustained and partly suppressed. He thought about him clearly, as the real and present danger that he was, a person, not a symbol. Dangerous, intelligent, utterly convinced of his own necessity. Capable of anything. Harry thought, you've been waiting for me to walk into your trap. You've been managing this from a distance, and your agent has been steering the tournament, and you think you're getting a boy who has been carefully kept small. He thought, surprise. He cast the first spell of the morning, non-verbal, and it hit the practice dummy and sent it completely through the wall. Fleur looked at the hole in the wall and then at him. Too much, he said. The maze walls will be hedges, she said. That will actually be useful. He repaired the wall with a thought and went back to work. Outside, the February cold held Hogwarts in its grey, patient grip, and the lake was still and dark, and somewhere under the castle, the foundations breathed with the old magic of a place that had seen hundreds of years of people preparing for difficult things. Harry felt it and worked within it and let it hold him the way it had held everyone who trained here, not with comfort, because the castle wasn't sentimental, but with the simple, solid fact of having held before and holding still. 3 months. Chapter 6, The Maze Burns Bright. June arrived like an argument one. The grounds went green overnight in the way Scottish spring sometimes did, grudging all the way through April and then suddenly, completely, as if embarrassed by the delay. The hedges that had been growing south of the castle since February were now 20 feet high and continuous, a dark wall of green that enclosed a space roughly the size of 3 Quidditch pitches. Harry had watched them grow from his dormitory window, tracking their height the way you track an approaching weather system, not with dread, with the specific attentive interest of someone who intends to be inside that thing and wants to know it. He knew it. He'd spent 3 months learning it from the outside. The wards that governed the maze were visible to his magical senses from the castle's upper floors, a complex, layered architecture that he'd mapped incrementally, the way you might survey terrain you can't physically enter. He understood its disorientation mechanics, the corridor-shifting enchantments, the creature placements that the tournament officials had installed over the past 2 weeks. He'd felt each addition arrive, felt the maze's magical weight increase as it approached readiness. It had been, in its own way, excellent intelligence work. He also knew who was going in there to kill him. The picture had finished assembling in May, when Barty Crouch Sr. had appeared on the grounds in a state of extreme agitation and been found dead by morning. Harry had been awake when it happened. He'd felt a disturbance in the wards, something sharp and specific that didn't match any of the maze's preparation work, and he'd lain in the dark and followed the shape of it and understood, the supply chain was severing itself. Crouch Jr. was removing the last person who could directly identify him. Harry had written to Sirius that morning with one line, "It's almost time. Be ready." Sirius had written back, "I'm here. Just say when." Dumbledore knew about Crouch Sr.'s death. He'd moved through the aftermath with the contained urgency of someone who was now running calculations at speed, and Harry had watched him move and thought, he's getting close. He's almost at the same picture I've had for 4 months. He'd considered, multiple times, the question of whether to give Dumbledore the complete picture before the 3rd task, whether the tactical advantage of Dumbledore being fully informed outweighed the risk of Dumbledore making a decision that sidelined Harry from his own situation. He'd decided, after the last of those considerations, on a middle path. He'd gone to Dumbledore's office 2 weeks before the task and told him, clearly and specifically, that he believed Alastor Moody was not Alastor Moody, that the impersonation had been running since September, and that the impersonator's purpose was to steer Harry towards something at the end of the 3rd task that was not a trophy room. He'd given Dumbledore the magical signature evidence, explained what he could sense in Moody's presence, the polyjuice layer and the Death Eater quality underneath it, and he'd watched Dumbledore absorb it with the terrible, still focus of someone receiving confirmation of their worst working theory. Dumbledore had said, "How long have you known?" Harry had said, "Since the 1st task." The silence in that office had been the most significant silence Harry had ever sat in. "Harry," Dumbledore had started. "I needed to know everything first," Harry said. "I needed to understand the whole mechanism before I changed any part of it. If we'd moved on Moody in November, whoever is at the other end of this would have known and adjusted." He'd held Dumbledore's gaze. "I made the right call." Dumbledore had looked at him for a very long time. Then he'd said, quietly, "Yes. I believe you did." That had been 2 weeks ago. In those 2 weeks, Dumbledore had apparently been doing things that Harry couldn't fully see but could feel in the castle's shifts, the ward adjustments, the quiet changes in personnel positioning, the way certain doors near the dungeon had started opening and closing at unusual hours. Dumbledore was setting things in motion. Harry had let him set them, because Dumbledore moving against Crouch Jr. from the outside while Harry dealt with the endpoint was better than either of them trying to cover both directions alone. He hadn't told Dumbledore about the graveyard. He'd kept one card. He'd told himself it was tactical and he believed it, and underneath the tactical reason was something more personal that he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge: the graveyard was his. What happened there was going to be his to decide, his to survive. He was not going to walk into it as someone else's instrument. He thought Dumbledore suspected. He thought Dumbledore had decided to let him. That was, possibly, the most significant thing Dumbledore had done all year. The morning of the third task was clear and cold, the early June warmth not yet burned through the morning air, the sky an uncomplicated blue that felt almost inappropriate for the occasion. Harry ate his breakfast with the specific attentiveness of someone consuming fuel rather than food. His body had learned this over the year, had adapted to his new expectations of it, and it performed like a thing that had been properly maintained. He ate without tasting much and drank his tea and looked across the hall at the Beauxbatons table, where Fleur was doing the same thing, and their eyes met briefly and she nodded, a small, precise motion that carried more than its size suggested. He nodded back. He thought about after this. He thought about the conversation she'd named in February, the different one, and he let himself think about it for exactly 30 seconds, clearly and without the old instinctive self-minimizing, and then he put it where he could find it later and focused on what was in front of him. Ron and Hermione walked him to the entrance of the maze at dusk, when the task was scheduled to begin. The crowd was already assembled on the banks around the maze's perimeter, not as visible as the Dragon Task's arena, but the noise was similar in quality. Thousands of people gathered for the particular spectacle of watching something dangerous happen to people who'd agreed to face it. The champions were scheduled to enter in order of current standing, Harry and Crumb tied first, Cedric third, Fleur fourth. "Don't do anything stupid," Hermione said, which was her version of "please come back." "Define stupid," Harry said. "Heroic but unnecessary." She looked at him with the steady, slightly shaken warmth she'd had since the Dragon Task. "If you have a choice between brilliant and safe, choose safe." "They're usually the same thing," he said. She made the sound. He smiled at her. He looked at Ron, who was doing the stoic jaw thing that was his version of managing large feelings in public spaces. "Mate," Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. Ron grabbed his arm briefly, not a hug, not a speech, just a hand on his forearm for 2 seconds, firm and warm. Then he let go. Harry turned to the maze entrance, where Bagman was bouncing on his heels with the anticipatory energy of a man who would be watching from outside, and thought, "Let's go." The maze was louder than he'd expected. Not from outside, from inside, the noise of the crowd fell away within 20 feet of the entrance, swallowed by the hedge walls and the disorientation charms and the dense magic that governed the space. What replaced it was the maze itself, a constant low working of enchantments, the rustle of things moving in the hedges, the breath of wind channeled by the corridors, and underneath all of it the deep, ancient, thoroughly indifferent magic of the tournament contract, old as Wizardkin's memory of itself, holding the space to its purpose. Harry stopped 2 steps in and found magnetic north. It was immediate, the thread was there, familiar now from 3 months of practice, the underlying directionality of the maze's ward structure. He oriented to it the way you orient to a compass point and held it in the background of his awareness, a constant reference against which the disorientation charms would have no purchase. He'd expected to have to work for it inside the maze. Instead it snapped into place like a key, and he thought, "Fleur's grandmother taught me to navigate." He moved. The maze's corridors were wide enough for 2 people abreast and the hedges were dense and dark above him, the sky a narrow blue channel overhead. The first junction, left or right, and he felt the ward architecture pull slightly toward the right, the corridor of lesser resistance, which almost certainly meant the higher value path was left. He went left. A boggart at the first corner. It looked at him and became Voldemort, the pale, serpentine, red-eyed version, full height, and Harry thought, ridiculous, and the boggart became a cartoon Voldemort, tiny and squeaky, and Harry walked past it while it deflated. He didn't stop moving. A blast-ended Scroot at the next junction, enormous, armored, moving with the blundering aggression of something that had never been improved by selective breeding. Harry went around it, not over it, not through it, around, because the corridor to the right was clear and the Scroot's attention was on the corridor ahead, and the cleanest route was always the path of least confrontation when confrontation wasn't necessary. He was making good time. He could feel the center of the maze the way he'd been able to feel the lake's depths, not with eyes, with the extended awareness that had been returning to him steadily since November, the full capacity that the blocks had compressed. The center was 20 minutes ahead, by his estimation, if the corridors held. They didn't hold. The maze shifted at his 13th junction. He felt it coming, the ward architecture flexing, the corridors reorganizing around him with the smooth mechanical certainty of a puzzle resetting, and he stopped and let it complete and then reoriented to magnetic north and built his map again from the new configuration. It cost him 45 seconds. He moved. A sphinx at the next corridor. She was enormous and ancient-looking, with the peculiarly Egyptian quality of a creature who had been in the service of riddle magic since before Hogwarts existed, and she regarded him with golden eyes and said, in a voice like stone warmed by sun, "A riddle." "Go ahead," Harry said. She gave it. It was a good riddle, not the simple kind, but a genuine construction, something with two layers, the surface answer and the real answer. He worked through it in 20 seconds, caught the second layer, gave the real answer, and watched her step aside with something in her expression that might have been approval. "Well done," she said. "Thank you," he said, and kept moving. He was 40 minutes in when he heard the scream. It was short and sharp and came from somewhere to his northeast, and he stopped and triangulated, female, not Fleur, the pitch was different, and he thought, trap, or genuine. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, weighed the costs, and moved northeast. He found a corridor that had been partly collapsed, one of the hedge walls damaged by a spell of considerable force, and at the end of the collapsed section he found the source, a third-year girl who had somehow gotten inside the maze boundary, which should not have been possible, which meant she'd been placed here, which meant someone had moved her through the wards deliberately, and the someone who could move things through the maze wards was the person who had helped build them. Crouch Jr. Harry understood immediately, not a hostage, not exactly, but a distraction. Someone put in his path to make him pause, to cost him time, to force a decision. The genius of it was that it was a complete trap whether he stopped or kept going, stop and lose time, keep going and carry the guilt of it. He stopped. He cast a rapid chain of diagnostic charms over the girl, unconscious, stunned, no physical injuries, and conjured a stretcher and cast it toward the maze entrance with a mobila corpus attached, aimed at the entrance and driven by a simple ward-following charm that would carry the stretcher along the maze walls toward the exit. It took him 1 minute and 20 seconds. He was moving again before the stretcher had turned the first corner. He felt the maze shift a second time, harder than the first, not a natural cycling, a forced reorganization, someone with their hands on the maze's control architecture pushing the corridors against him. He felt the push and leaned into the magnetic north anchor and kept his map and lost less ground than whoever was pushing had intended him to lose. He thought, Crouch Jr. is at the control point. He's watching me in the maze and he's trying to steer me. He thought, where does he want me to go? He stopped at the next junction and felt the ward architecture carefully, the way Fleur had taught him to read it in the training room, not just the surface but the intention underneath. The corridors to his left and right were both viable, both within the correct general direction. But one of them had a slight different quality to its enchantment, not wrong, just different, the way a stage set has the right appearance of a room but the wrong smell. The left corridor wanted him to go through it. He went right. Something hit the hedge wall to his left as he moved right, a controlled burst of something dark, precise, delivered through the maze architecture itself, a pressure applied to the corridor he'd just declined to take. He felt it and catalogued it, direct intervention, escalating. Crouch Jr. was done with subtle steering. He moved faster. He found the center of the maze at 52 minutes, which he knew because he'd been counting, and it was almost anticlimactic in its physical presentation, a clearing in the hedges, torchlit, the Triwizard cup on a stone plinth in the middle of it, glowing with the old gold of genuine power and also with something else, something that Harry identified in the half-second before he touched it, a portkey. He stopped 3 feet from it. The cup was the portkey. This was the mechanism: touch the cup, win the tournament, get transported to wherever Voldemort was waiting. The trap was the trophy. The entire tournament architecture had been built around getting one specific person to touch one specific object at one specific moment. Harry stood in a clearing and did not touch it. He looked around. The clearing was empty. He was first to the center. He could feel the other champions in the maze behind him, Crumb somewhere to his west, Cedric to his south, Fleur further back, and none of them were close. He had the clearing to himself. He cast a diagnostic charm on the cup and the port key confirmed itself, destination encoded, timing set, a one-way transport with no return mechanism built in. He cast 3 more charms, mapping the port key's specific architecture, and the destination resolved as a location outside Hogwarts' ward boundary, somewhere rural, some place that had been prepared. He could feel the preparation in the port key's magic, the deliberate work of someone who had arranged a space very carefully. He felt what the space was for. He cancelled the diagnostic charms and thought. Behind him, the maze was moving, the controlled reorganization of Crouch Jr. pushing the other champions toward the center, herding them into the position where they'd reach the cup and the simplest competitive instinct would make them grab it. Cedric was going to arrive in approximately 4 minutes. Harry had 4 minutes to make a decision. He took out his wand. He was going to go. He'd decided this, he realized, without knowing when he'd decided it, at some point in the past 6 months, in the training room or at the bank of the lake or in the dark of the dormitory with his returned mind working through the geometry of the situation, he'd arrived at the conclusion that the graveyard was the thing he had to face. Not because it was required. Not because the tournament contract compelled it. Because Voldemort was real and present and was going to keep being both of those things until someone stood in front of him and refused to be what he needed them to be. He'd refused to be small since November. He might as well refuse to be dead. But he was not going to arrive at the graveyard unprepared and alone. He cast a Patronus, the stag, full corporeality, enormous and bright in the torchlit clearing, and sent it back through the maze with a message attached, an ability he developed in January after reading about it in a defense text, Maze Center. Cup is a port key. Real Moody is Crouch Jr. Tell Dumbledore. Come if you can. The stag moved through the hedge walls like they weren't there, patron uses were not bound by physical magic, and disappeared. He looked at the cup. He thought about after this. He thought about it very clearly and held it. Then he reached out and picked up the Triwizard cup with both hands. The world lurched. The port key was instant and disorienting in the specific way of long-distance transport, a hook behind the navel, the world dissolving and reforming, the sensation of moving through a space that wasn't space. It lasted 3 seconds and then he was standing on solid ground in the dark. A graveyard. He stood there and let his senses fill the space. Dark, cold, the smell of old stone and night grass. Headstones in rows, the shapes of them irregular in the moonlight, a church spire in the far distance. A large house on a hill above the graveyard, dark, no lights. He was not alone. A figure in robes, holding something that moved, something small, wrapped, making a thin, ugly sound. And behind the figure, standing against a headstone, someone bound with conjured ropes, head hanging, and Harry recognized the magical signature before he saw the face, a human being, alive, afraid, someone Crouch Jr. had brought here before Harry arrived. Harry Potter, said a voice from the wrapped bundle, and it was a voice like dry leaves in a dead season, and it was Voldemort. Not in body, not yet. In the rudimentary form that the newspaper reports and Dumbledore's hints had suggested, the diminished, parasitic form that was all that remained of him. The voice coming from the bundle was fully present, fully aware, utterly certain of itself. Tom, Harry said. A silence. An extraordinary silence, the kind that comes when a person has been addressed in a way they did not expect. The figure holding the bundle turned. Harry could see a face, Wormtail, Peter Pettigrew, pale and trembling and also purposeful, doing what he'd always done, serving whoever frightened him most in whatever way they needed. Kill him, Voldemort said, from the bundle. Now. Avada Kedavra, said Wormtail, and he said it with the reflexive, compliant speed of a man who has been waiting for the instruction, pointing his wand at Harry in the same motion. Harry moved. Not sideways. He'd expected the curse from the moment he'd arrived, and he'd spent 6 months studying exactly this, the mechanics of it, the line of sight requirements, the absolute necessity of getting out of the path because there was no blocking it. He'd moved before Wormtail finished the incantation, a dropping sidestep that put a headstone between him and the green light, and the killing curse hit the stone and the stone exploded into fragments, and Harry was already moving again, already behind the next headstone, already thinking. "He moves," Voldemort said, and there was something in the voice, not surprise, but the elevation of attention that someone brought to a thing that was more interesting than expected. Harry thought about the bound person at the headstone. He cast Accio over the nearest headstone's top edge, aimed at the ropes binding them, and heard a tearing sound and a sudden gasping from that direction, ropes giving way, someone stumbling free, someone alive and disoriented but mobile. "Get down and stay down," Harry said, to wherever the person was in the dark. "Expulso," said Wormtail, and Harry felt the headstone in front of him shatter from the force curse and was already gone, moving on his feet, low and fast between the rows of headstones, thinking, "I can't stay mobile indefinitely. I need to end this." He needed to end this before the ritual. He'd read about the ritual. He'd read about it in December, in a dark arts historical text that had been misfiled in the restricted section under something about arithmancy, the revival ritual for a disembodied Dark Lord, the ingredients, the sequence, the irreversible nature of it once begun. The ritual needed Harry's blood. Without his blood it couldn't be completed in the way Voldemort needed. That was why Harry was here, why he'd been brought here, why the whole year had been constructed around bringing him here alive. If Harry wasn't here, the ritual couldn't happen tonight. He stopped behind a large stone monument and thought very fast and did the only thing that was both true to his nature and actually strategically sound. He stepped out from behind the monument. "Stop," he said. Wormtail froze, wand raised, the instinctive hesitation of someone who has been told to stop by a confident voice. "You need me alive," Harry said. He addressed the bundle, not Wormtail. "You need my blood. You've built this entire year around getting me here. Kill me now and the ritual doesn't work." The silence that followed was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of acknowledgement, the silence of someone who recognizes a correct assessment and is deciding whether to confirm it. "Clever," Voldemort said, from the bundle. "The boy has learned to think." "I've had a good year," Harry said. "Yes," Voldemort said, and there was something in his voice that Harry had not expected, a genuine, if cold, interest. "You have. I've heard reports. My servant tells me you've been different this year. Not the boy we planned for." "No," Harry said. "I'm not." "It doesn't matter," Voldemort said. "We need your blood, not your cooperation. Hold him, Wormtail." And the graveyard moved. Not literally, but the magic in it did. The portkey had activated something. Arriving at the graveyard with Harry's body had triggered the first phase of the ritual's preparation, and now the ground was responding, the ritual space waking up with the specific, horrible aliveness of very old dark magic finally getting what it had been waiting for. Harry felt it and felt Wormtail moving toward him and felt the whole weight of the situation bearing down, and he thought, "I sent the Patronus. I don't know if it arrived. I don't know if help is coming. I need to survive until it does or survive without it." He let Wormtail get 3 steps closer and then cast a stunning hex that was not a stunning hex, it was a stunning hex's magical signature with a disarming charms core, the kind of combination casting that wasn't in any textbook because it was the product of 3 months of experimental work in a cold classroom at 6 in the morning. It hit Wormtail at chest height and took his wand and his balance simultaneously, and Wormtail went down and the wand landed 6 feet away in the dark grass. Harry picked it up with Accio before Wormtail had registered the loss. He looked at the bundle. Voldemort in his diminished form, temporarily without a servant capable of the ritual. Harry could, he thought, simply leave, summon the portkey, trigger the return, get out. He thought about it and thought about it and thought, no. Because this doesn't end here. Because this never ends until it ends properly. Because Voldemort will find another servant and another ritual and another year's worth of planning, and it will keep happening until the thing that has to happen happens. He thought about the prophecy, which Dumbledore had never directly told him about and which he'd found in the library in March, in a secondary source that referenced it obliquely enough to confirm that it existed and approximately what it said. Neither can live while the other survives. He understood what that meant, completely, with the full processing capacity of his unblocked mind. He understood it didn't mean what it sounded like. It wasn't a sentence about death, it was a sentence about living. It was a statement about how the world was constructed while this particular opposition existed. He could not live, fully, freely, in the way he intended to live, with Fleur, with Ron and Hermione, with his magic fully his own, with no managed destiny, while Voldemort was in the world trying to return to it. The ending was here. Not tonight, perhaps, not in this graveyard, not with Voldemort in this diminished form. But tonight was the beginning of the ending. Tonight was his choice. He raised his wand. He'd done something in January that he hadn't told anyone about, including Ron, including Hermione, including Fleur. He'd gone into the room of requirement with a very specific need, the knowledge required to protect myself from the worst magic that will be used against me. The room had given him a library of 6 books, all of them dark arts texts that shouldn't have been in a school at all, and he'd spent 3 weeks reading them and learning them with the new, full-capacity mind that could hold what the old one couldn't have managed. The counter curse. Not a shield, there was no shield against the killing curse. But there was something else, something that the books had described in fragments that he'd assembled into a whole, a curse chain breaker, a spell that worked not on the curse in transit but on the magical architecture generating it, severing the connection between intent and execution. It required the caster's power to be sufficient to overwhelm the generator's power at the moment of casting. He thought about his magical core, fully expanded, uncompressed, the actual measure of what he was. He thought, sufficient. He cast it at the bundle. The magic left his wand in a color he'd never seen before, not a color that had a name, something between gold and white that left no afterimage, and hit the bundle and the bundle shrieked, a sound that was not a child's sound or an adult's sound but the sound of something very old and very angry at being interrupted, and then the magic of the ritual space collapsed. Not destroyed, cancelled. The preparation that had been waking in the graveyard went dormant again, deactivated, and the bundle went still and the sound stopped. In the sudden silence, Harry heard the crack of apparition behind him. He spun, wand up. Dumbledore. And behind Dumbledore, a dozen Aurors, and Fawkes the Phoenix high above them, the birds' fire-colored light illuminating the graveyard in a warm and living way that the torchlit clearing had not been, and Sirius was there, in robes not rags, standing at Dumbledore's shoulder with his wand drawn and his eyes scanning the graveyard for Harry, and when they found him Sirius's entire body changed in a way that was probably the most genuine thing Harry had ever seen from an adult. "Harry," Sirius said. "I'm all right," Harry said. He was. He checked himself, physically, magically, the full assessment that had become automatic, and he was undamaged, clear, slightly depleted from the major casting but not seriously so. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at the still bundle on the ground, and at Wormtail unconscious in the grass, and at the ritual space that had been cancelled, and his expression was not the recalibrated expression Harry had come to know from their corridor meetings. It was something stripped down to its foundations, an old man looking at a situation that had gone differently from every configuration he'd planned for, and finding, in the difference, something he hadn't expected to feel. Relief. "The portkey," Harry said. "The cup is still active. We can track the destination back to Crouch Jr." Dumbledore looked at him. "We know where Crouch Jr. is," he said. "He was apprehended at Hogwarts 40 minutes ago." A pause. "Your Patronus arrived." Harry breathed. "And the real Moody?" "Alive," Dumbledore said. "In a trunk under the floor of his own office. He'll need significant care, but he is alive." Harry nodded. He looked at the graveyard, the headstones, the dark grass, the bundle that was still and the unconscious worm tail and the cancelled ritual and the aurors moving efficiently through the space. He looked at Sirius, who hadn't moved from where he'd arrived and who was still watching Harry with that undisguised quality. He crossed the graveyard to him. Sirius grabbed him first, not a hug exactly, something more urgent, both hands on Harry's shoulders and a grip that said, "You're real, you're here, you're all right." Harry let it happen and gripped back and felt, for the first time since the night in November when everything had cracked open and remade itself, something that he could only call safe in the specific way that safety required the presence of someone who knew you and held you in full and still wanted to. "You could have warned me you were going to take the cup," Sirius said, into the top of Harry's head. "I didn't decide until I got to the clearing," Harry said. "That is not comforting," Sirius said. "I know," Harry said. He pulled back and looked at Dumbledore, who had been watching the two of them with an expression that Harry had never seen on his face before and which he thought, with the full emotional intelligence now available to him, was something like contrition. "After this is finished," Dumbledore said. "You said." "I did," Harry said. "Tomorrow, if you like." Dumbledore nodded. He looked older than Harry had ever seen him look, which was considerable given that he'd always looked ancient. Not physically, the height and the authority were the same. But something in the foundation of him had shifted tonight in a way that Harry thought was probably necessary and probably painful and probably overdue. "You should go back," Dumbledore said. "Your friends are waiting." Harry looked at the graveyard one more time. The cancelled ritual. The unconscious worm tail, who was already being bound by aurors, who was going back to Azkaban for a very long time. The diminished Voldemort in the bundle, who was not dead, Harry had no illusions about that. The cursed chain breaker had cancelled the ritual and bought time, not ended what needed to be ended, but who was set back by something he hadn't planned for and hadn't known to plan for. He thought, not tonight. But the beginning of the ending is tonight, and the difference between me and the boy he planned for is the whole difference that matters. He took the cup from the grass where he'd dropped it when he'd moved from Wormtail's first curse, cast a nonverbal hominum revelio on it to check it was still active, and held it out to Dumbledore. "For the aurors," he said. "Evidence." Dumbledore took it. Harry operated back to Hogwarts with Sirius, side along, Sirius's magic carrying them both, and the school's wards recognized the headmaster's pendant that Dumbledore had given Harry in the graveyard for exactly this purpose, and they arrived at the castle's entrance in the cool June night with the stars above them and the maze lit in the distance and the sound of the crowd, confused and buzzing with something having gone differently than expected. At the maze entrance, two people were standing. The tournament officials had clearly tried to usher everyone back and failed with these two specifically. Ron was easy to read from 20 feet away, relief detonating behind his eyes at the sight of Harry, followed by the stoic jaw thing, followed by a slightly shaky exhale. Fleur was harder to read. She was standing very still and her arms were crossed and her expression was the composed version, fully assembled, and Harry recognized it for what it was, the armor you put on when you're frightened and you need to not look frightened. He crossed to them. Ron grabbed his arm again, same 2-second grip, and Harry put his free hand over Ron's briefly, and Hermione appeared from behind Ron and made a sound that was a compressed version of everything she felt about the night and then seemed to decide a full accounting could wait and simply stood there looking at him. He looked at Fleur. She looked back at him. The composed surface held for 3 seconds, and then something in it eased, not a collapse but a choosing. She chose to lower it, in front of the others, in front of Sirius who was standing behind Harry and looking at Fleur with the assessing interest of a godfather evaluating someone his godson has spent a year training with at 5 in the morning. "You're all right," she said. "I'm all right," he said. "The task, done," he said. "I'll tell you everything. Tonight if you want." She looked at him. "I want," she said. He nodded. Then he looked at Sirius, who had composed his expression into something neutral that was fooling nobody, and at Ron, who had given up the stoic jaw and was simply grinning with the wholehearted, uncomplicated relief of someone whose best friend has just survived a graveyard, and at Hermione, who was already mentally drafting what was probably a comprehensive written account of everything that had happened since the task began. Come on, Harry said. Let's get inside. They walked toward the castle together, not a dramatic procession, just 5 people crossing a school's grounds on a June night, the grass damp underfoot, the stars very bright, the maze lit behind them and Hogwarts lit ahead. Harry felt the school's magic around him the way he'd felt it since November, the old, vast, thoroughly familiar presence of a place that had been holding people through difficult things for centuries. He felt his own magic inside that larger presence, fully his, fully awake, enormous and clear and entirely his own. He felt the tournament's binding contract ease and release, the old magic acknowledging, done. Complete. You survived it. He thought, yes. We did. He didn't think about everything that was still ahead, Voldemort still in the world, the war that was coming, the prophecy and its weight and the long road between now and whatever came at the end of it. Those things were real and he didn't pretend otherwise. He kept them in the accessible place where he kept serious things, available when needed. But right now, in this moment, walking through the June night with his best friend and his godfather and the person who had cracked him open like a window on a bright day and changed everything, what he felt was not the grim, managed stoicism of a boy who has been told to be brave for reasons he doesn't fully understand. What he felt was himself. Fully, completely, without the fog, without the 30% ceiling, without the installed smallness or the managed destiny or the careful limitation of a person being kept in the shape that suited someone else's plan. 14 years old, 15 in January, and standing in his own full height for the first time, and the height was considerable. He looked up at the stars. Fleur fell into step beside him, close enough that their arms almost touched, and he let himself feel the warmth of her presence the way he let himself feel the castle's presence, completely, without the reflexive deflection of someone who has been told their feelings are a complication. She said, "Your Patronus form." "The stag," he said. "I saw it come through the maze wall," she said. "Through the hedge. Like it wasn't there." "Patron uses are like that," he said. "I know what patron uses are," she said. "I am saying I saw yours, and it was," she paused, "it was a great deal of stag." He laughed. She didn't, but the corner of her mouth moved, and he thought, "After this," we said. "This is after." "Tomorrow," he said. "That conversation." She glanced at him sideways. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Behind them, Ron said something to Hermione and Hermione responded and Sirius made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, and the castle doors opened before them with the familiar heaviness of enchanted oak, and the warmth inside came out to meet them, and Harry Potter walked into Hogwarts as himself, finally and completely as himself, and did not look back at the maze. There was nothing behind him that he needed anymore.